I'm a tycoon in World War I, starting by saving France. Hey, fanfic family. So glad to see you here again to continue this incredible adventure. As always, kindly remember, this story is 100% fiction. So don't go looking for dimensional portals in your closet. All rights to this fantastic novel belong to the original author. We're just your humble narrators of epic tales. Are you enjoying the fanfic? Show it by subscribing to our YouTube channel and dropping us a like. And if you're impatient for more exclusive content, our Patreon is your happy place. Chapter 651 Supplier Rights. Charles wielded considerable control over both the army and the air force. This included military ranks, prestige, command authority, and the production and supply of major equipment for both. For example, the army's tanks would eventually have dedicated tank guns and dual-stabilized fire control systems. The Air Force's fighter jets, bombers, and engine technology were all directly controlled by the Bernard Group, that is, Charles. Only equipment with low technological content and readily replaceable components, such as rifles, mines, machine guns, and mortars, were entrusted to the St. Etienne and FN arms factories. The Navy was a different story. Charles held neither military rank nor command authority in the Navy. His connection to the Navy was ultimately limited to the Wells shipyard. He might have some prestige. After all, Charles was at the height of his power in France at this time, and even within the Navy, few were unaware of him, but prestige was intangible. It amounted to nothing in the face of a powerful figure like Lieutenant General Gapret. One day, if Charles and Vice Admiral Gapret had a conflict of interest, or if a political rival persuaded or bribed Vice Admiral Gapret, Charles's entire naval strategy could be overturned instantly. This was no small matter. It concerned Charles's control over resources and even his influence. One wrong move and everything would be lost. Charles certainly wouldn't let the opportunity presented to him slip away. Vice Admiral Gapret asked, his eyes filled with anticipation, "How much funding do you plan to provide for the Navy?" "It's uncertain yet," Charles replied after a moment's thought. "Nobody knows how far the war will develop, nor does anyone know how much the Navy needs. However, I plan to initially invest $15 million to build 10 new destroyers with a displacement of around 2,000 tons. $15 million was roughly Charles's monthly income. Note, this price is based on the purchase of 4 1,000-ton British peace destroyers by Greece in 1916 for 148,000 British pounds each, equivalent to $713,000. Vice Admiral Gaplet was overjoyed. $15 million? Are you sure? Vice Admiral Gaplet couldn't believe that Charles would invest such a huge sum in the first phase. France only had 3 destroyers under construction, and 1 battleship was essentially stalled halfway through construction. This was with the entire nation's resources. Yet Charles could build 10 destroyers at once, and new types at that. "Of course, Vice Admiral," Charles said confidently, "there will be more funding and scarce resources to follow. I hope to build the French Navy into the strongest navy in the region." Vice Admiral Gaplet nodded heavily. He understood Charles's meaning. The world's strongest navy was just across the Strait of La Manche. Charles is building the strongest in the region was actually the strongest in the world. God, was the French Navy's spring truly coming? Lieutenant General Gapret felt a wave of dizziness. However, he quickly regained his composure. He knew that while Charles was a general who had rendered countless service to France, he was also a capitalist. Any capitalist would consider their own interests. They wouldn't give away funds for no reason, especially such a large sum. Charles was certainly no exception. "Thank you very much, Lieutenant General." Lieutenant General Gapret composed himself and shook Charles's hand with a somewhat official gesture. "On behalf of all the citizens of France and all the officers and men of the Navy, I thank you for your generosity. We will not forget your contribution. It is only right, General," Charles replied. "It is also our common goal, wouldn't you say?" "Of course." Lieutenant General Gapret nodded, then asked tactfully, "However, do you have any requests? I mean, we can't let you invest such a large sum of money for nothing." Charles pretended to consider for a moment before replying, "You're right, General. After all, the Bernard Group isn't just mine. While I would be happy to donate this money to the Navy, I have to consider the interests of others. Or, how about we consider this money as a purchase of the Navy's supply rights?" Lieutenant General Gapret was taken aback. "Supplier rights?" "Yes," Charles explained. "In short, it means being responsible for the Navy's officers and men's supplies, including daily necessities, ammunition, fuel, weapons, and so on. I recently plan to expand my shipping business. My shipping company will be continuously transporting supplies from the United States. I only hope to make a little profit to offset the losses. This was half true and half false. Expanding shipping business was real. With control over shipping routes, building his own merchant fleet to transport supplies was obviously a highly profitable venture. Besides, he felt more secure with control of the transport rights. Otherwise, he could still be held hostage by others. The hope to make a profit to offset the losses was a pretense. Charles's true aim was to control the Navy's supplies, thereby expanding his influence within the Navy. If the Navy ever disobeyed, Charles could simply cut off the supplies. This was especially true for irreplaceable supplies like weapons and ammunition, including the potential future carrier-based aircraft. Vice Admiral Gappert understood this, of course. He hesitated for a moment, weighing the options in his mind. He agreed. Gappert's only loss was gaining a superior. He might have to listen to Charles from now on. This couldn't even be called a loss. With the support of Charles, a capitalist with immense wealth, the Brest faction didn't even need to worry about suppression from the Secretary of the Navy or parliamentary funding. Furthermore, there was even greater room for development, and likely many more victories. A victory, in particular, would be a significant achievement for Vice Admiral Gappert, perhaps even earning him a place in history if he defeated the Royal Navy and became the world's leading navy. Disagree. The French Navy would immediately fall into further trouble, and Charles might completely abandon the Brest fleet. Victory and glory would be out of the question. He might even be disbanded and incorporated into the Toulon fleet. Thinking of this, Vice Admiral Gappert no longer hesitated. He nodded. No problem, Vice Admiral. I believe you will be a good partner. You won't overcharge for supplies, will you? This was another concern of Vice Admiral Gappert. If Charles obtained supplier rights and then demanded exorbitant prices, it would affect the morale of the naval officers and men. Charles laughed. Don't worry, General. I will use the Royal Navy's food standards and prices as a reference. I guarantee that the supplies I provide will only be cheaper than theirs, not more expensive. Otherwise, I am willing to compensate 10 times the price. The Royal Navy's supply prices were already 2 to 3 times the market price, and there was still a huge profit margin. Chapter 652 The key is the engine. No sooner had Lieutenant General Gapeletz left than King Albert I followed, accompanied by Major General Eden, into the office. Long time no see, General. King Albert I greeted Charles with a broad smile, shaking his hand. He then took a box and certificate from Major General Eden and presented them to Charles with both hands. This is the Order of Leopold, General, in recognition of your contributions to Belgium. The image above shows the Order of Leopold, one of Belgium's 3 national knightly honors, awarded personally by the king to dignitaries or members of the royal family for outstanding contributions. Charles wasn't particularly interested in the medal, but out of politeness, he rose, saluted, accepted it with both hands, and expressed his gratitude. King Albert I pulled up a chair and sat down opposite Charles. General, I heard you defeated the Germans at sea and sank a battle cruiser. Yes, Charles nodded. I want to confirm something, said King Albert I, about that aircraft capable of carrying torpedoes to attack enemy warships. Charles took the document from his staff, opened it, and signed it as he answered. You want to know if the British have the capability to carry torpedoes into the air like I do? King Albert I paused, then laughed, a slight embarrassment on his face. You guessed right, Vice Admiral. I need an answer. Charles stopped what he was doing and raised his eyes. Let me put it this way, Your Majesty, although it's not possible now, it's only a matter of time before the British mount torpedoes on aircraft. You know that's inevitable. King Albert I frowned slightly and nodded thoughtfully. He had thought about this on the way here. With Britain's industrial and technological capabilities, if they caught up with all their might, they could develop a similar torpedo attack aircraft in no time. At that time, Charles would still be at a disadvantage at sea, and the Belgian maritime threat would still exist. But Charles changed the subject. However, I think you don't need to worry about that, Your Majesty. Why? King Albert I asked, puzzled. His idea was to compare enemy and friendly equipment 1-to-1, like a match 3 puzzle. Torpedo bombers against torpedo bombers, warships against warships, ultimately concluding that the Royal Navy had the advantage. However, actual combat was not like that. Charles reminded him, the important thing is the fighter plane. Fighter plane. Albert I looked bewildered. It can carry torpedoes too, Charles shook his head and answered calmly, "No, Your Majesty, it can shoot down enemy bombers carrying torpedoes." Albert I suddenly understood, nodding repeatedly with his mouth slightly agape. Major General Eden, standing behind him, also understood. He exclaimed, "Yes, fighter jets can seize air superiority. As long as they're there, no torpedo bombers can get close to our warships, so, they're the most important, and no, it's the General's fighter jets that are the most advanced." But then Major General Eden hesitated, saying, "But, General, Britain seems to have acquired a batch of Camel fighter jets. Does this mean?" Charles held his pen in his hand and pointed it at Major General Eden in the air, "And the key to a fighter jet is the engine, Major General. It determines whether a fighter jet can fly faster, farther, and more maneuverably." Major General Eden and Albert I exchanged a glance, then relaxed. Clearly, Charles possessed the most advanced engine. From this, it wasn't hard to deduce that Charles was the one who could completely control the La Manche Strait. Of course, Albert I breathed a sigh of relief. "I've always believed this. No one can compare to you, General, whether on land or at sea." Charles smiled but didn't speak. Albert I's very question proved he wasn't firmly convinced. However, Charles considered this understandable. As king, he had to plan for Belgium's future. After all, a single misstep or oversight could bring Belgium to ruin. "General," a messenger reported, "General Winter has arrived. He wishes to speak with you." Charles raised an eyebrow at Albert I, and the others exchanged knowing smiles, all guessing why General Winter had come. Soon, General Winter appeared at the office door. He was pale, hunched over, and sucking in cold air, clearly having caught a chill on the plane. General Winter paused upon seeing Albert I, then shook his head with a wry smile and shook hands with several people. "It seems my trip won't go as planned, is it?" General Winter shrugged at Charles. Belgium's interest lay in using Charles alone to fend off threats from all other nations, including the naval threat from Britain. Therefore, the fact that Albert I was present and that Charles hadn't asked him to leave indicated that the chances of successful negotiations were slim. Charles didn't answer, but simply had an orderly make General Winter a cup of coffee, saying, "Have a cup of coffee before you go. It's not easy for you to come all this way." "But Lieutenant General," General Winter persisted, "if Britain could also possess this torpedo bomber, we could easily blockade the North Sea and even defeat the German Navy in a short time. Don't you want to see victory?" This was a moral blackmail of Charles, linking not giving Britain torpedo bombers with not wanting to see victory. "Think about it, Lieutenant General," General Winter added. "Thousands upon thousands of soldiers are dying on the battlefield, people are suffering from the torment of war, are starving, many are freezing and starving to death. And you are the only one who can save them." This was the rhetoric General Winter had prepared on the way. Since Charles was a capitalist with a conscience, this was the only way to move him. Otherwise, no one would be foolish enough to provide torpedo bombers to the world's leading naval power. They were the bane of battleships, a weapon to dethrone Britain from its naval supremacy. But Charles remained unmoved. He nodded in agreement but smiled without speaking, signing documents on his own. King Albert I and Rear Admiral Eden sat silently to the side, sipping coffee with an air of detached amusement. Politics is pragmatic. In the face of national interests, grand pronouncements are utterly futile. General Winter, exasperated, could only say, "Lieutenant General, I imagine you wouldn't want the media to publish these words, would you?" His tone carried a hint of threat. Charles glanced at Winter with surprise, then calmly replied, "You may have forgotten, General, but if you and your country consider the sacrifices and suffering of your soldiers and people, you could end this war at any time." General Winter was speechless. Charles was right. The Germans had long called for peace negotiations. It was only because politicians bought off by the United States had obstructed and misled the public that ceasefire negotiations had failed. Therefore, as a British citizen, he has no right to say such things. Chapter 653, A Community of Shared Destiny. General Winter left disappointed. He sent a telegram from Antwerp to the First Lord of the Admiralty. "We all know very well that Charles will not sell this technology. If we hold a gun to the enemy's head, we can easily seize his bag of gold coins and everything else, then we will not agree to let him use that bag of gold coins to buy the gun. Therefore, Charles will not agree either." Balfour, who hadn't slept for 2 days and 3 nights, could only nod helplessly after seeing the telegram. "It seems we have no choice but to find a way to catch up with Charles ourselves." His gaze drifted out of the window of the War Office building. Snowflakes continued to fall in London, shrouded in a oppressive fog, showing no sign of winter's passing or spring's arrival, as if brewing an even more violent storm. King Albert I was quite satisfied with the trip. He even hummed a song in his car on the way back to Hasselt. "Do you know, Major General," Albert I said smugly to Major General Eden, "for nearly a century, Belgium has been trying to maintain a balance among several great powers, including the Netherlands. Now, we are finally about to end these days of constant anxiety." Albert I was weary of the forced maneuvering between the great powers, and the scornful looks from others. Note, Belgium gained independence from the Netherlands in 1830, making this book 86 years old. "Yes, Your Majesty," Major General Eden wholeheartedly agreed. "Alliance with the Charles is our wisest choice." By siding with the Charles, Belgium, while not yet a pawn, had come very close. One day, when Belgium fully implemented the Charles's defense system and was capable of confronting the threats of the three great powers, no one would consider Belgium a viable option anymore. "No," Albert I objected. "Not allies, but friends, Major General. The most reliable and trustworthy friend." Lieutenant General Jeplet insisted on keeping his command post at Antwerp Airport, right below Charles's building. The fighting in the North Sea had largely subsided, and in principle, he didn't need to remain at the airport. Accustomed to the sea breeze and the sight of warships in the harbor, he found the noise of planes taking off and landing at the airport unbearable, causing his ears to ring and even making him dizzy. However, he refused to move to the harbor, even though the airport wasn't far away. "This isn't just about operational coordination," Lieutenant General Jeplet told his staff officer, "it's about tactical and even strategic direction, understand? And we should get used to airplanes, not just get used to them, but understand them. Airplanes could be everything." Lieutenant General Jeplet stood at the window, staring blankly at the fighter jets taking off and landing outside, a sense of loss washing over him. Jeplet came from a naval family. His grandfather had even commanded sailing warships under Napoleon. From childhood, he was instilled with the idea that the Navy is everything. It determines a nation's prosperity and strength, and no other branch of the military can surpass it. You should aspire to be an excellent naval commander and be proud of it. However, he suddenly realized that reality was quite different. The Air Force was rising, and the Navy seemed insignificant in its presence. Warships could only travel at speeds of around 30 knots, 50 kilometers per hour, while aircraft could easily reach speeds of over 100 or even 200 kilometers per hour, and would become even faster in the future. Warships could only see 40 kilometers ahead, while aircraft at high altitudes could easily spot warships hundreds of kilometers away. Warships had no initiative in combat and could only passively wait for aircraft to attack, while aircraft could fight or flee at will. Vice Admiral Gappert was unwilling to accept this. He constantly rehearsed in his mind, hoping to find a way for the Navy to defeat the Air Force, or rather, a way out for the Navy. But in the end, without exception, he rejected all of them himself. Finally, he sighed and muttered to himself, "Charles was right. Air superiority determines everything, especially in naval warfare, while land warfare can mitigate the impact of aircraft through smoke, forests, trenches, and tunnels. The flat and wide sea makes warships mere targets." With a heavy heart, Lieutenant General Jeplet turned and walked to the communications room, ordering the communications officer, "Send a telegram to the Brest shipyard. Charles will fund the construction of 10 new destroyers for our army. We hope your unit will send someone to Antwerp as soon as possible to negotiate." Brest shipyard. 3 days had passed since Charles' victory in the North Sea, and Wells' initial elation had gradually cooled. He was at the shipyard directing workers to install echo detectors on the destroyers. The 1,000-ton Adventure-class destroyers faced a dilemma. Their displacement was fixed, and their guns, torpedoes, personnel, and supplies were nearing their limits. To install echo detectors and related equipment and personnel, they would have to reduce other supplies and even armament, such as the number of torpedoes. "We need more funding," Wells frowned at the blueprints. "We need to build larger destroyers to meet our current operational needs." However, Wells thought this was unlikely. The military had devoted most of its funds to the army fighting the Germans, leaving the Navy with limited funds. The Minister of the Navy was also planning to shift resources to the Toulon shipyard, and the 2 newly completed battleships had already been transferred there. Note, during World War I, France built 3 battleships and 2 destroyers. The 3 battleships were the Brittany class. Construction began in 1909, and the French Navy concentrated its funds on building them, hoping they would play a role on the battlefield. Even if Charles had achieved victory in the North Sea, it wouldn't change anything. The stubborn Minister of the Navy would still invest in battleships. Then, once the last Provence was completed, it would be transferred to Tours. Just then, the secretary, breathless, rushed to Wells and reported, "Sir, good news." Wells, without looking up, asked, "Another victory?" This didn't mean much. The Secretary of the Navy wouldn't change his strategy. He always believed the North Sea and the Atlantic were British territory, and the French Navy's involvement was superfluous, a waste, a pointless struggle and adventure. "No, sir," the Secretary replied, "it's a telegram from Vice Admiral Gappert. He said Charles will fund the construction of 10 new destroyers for the Navy." Wells looked up sharply at the Secretary, hesitatingly asking, You're telling the truth?" "Absolutely, sir," the Secretary replied. And Vice Admiral Gappert reported this to the government, requesting that these 10 new destroyers be transferred from the Brest Navy. "Fantastic," Wells exclaimed, 10 ships. How much will that cost?" "The point is, this is just the beginning, a very good beginning." Wells was a businessman. He knew that once the Brest Navy began competing with the Royal Navy, orders would flood the Brest shipyard. At that time, the Brest shipyard will not only not decline because of the Secretary of the Navy's strategic direction, but will rise rapidly. Therefore, Wells and Lieutenant General Gappert are bound by a common destiny, which is the basis for their mutual trust and friendship. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 654 Game Mindset. It wouldn't be difficult for Vice Admiral Gappert to gain control of the 10 new destroyers. In his report, he stated, "These 10 destroyers were funded by the Brest Navy. If the government wants to transfer them to Toulon in the future, there will be no funding." Thus, the government faced a choice: disagree, and the French Navy would get nothing; agree, and the French Navy would receive 10 destroyers, although they would operate in the Atlantic and North Sea under the command of the Brest faction. Anyone with common sense would know which to choose. In fact, Parliament and the government wanted the other. Brian and Clemenceau even agreed that the 10 destroyers shouldn't be started. "We all know this is Charles's first step in controlling the Navy," Clemenceau said, "albeit only the Brest Navy. Furthermore, he can use this to strengthen his control over supplies." "I know," Brian nodded in reply, "but we have no reason to refuse." Refuse warships funded by Charles? Refuse Charles's victory in the North Sea? Refuse Charles's control over supplies? This would only trigger another mutiny, or even a nationwide riot. People would think their Prime Minister and members of Parliament had gone mad, or that the members of Parliament had been bribed by the British or even the Germans. Because that simply didn't make sense, it could only be explained as treason. Clemenceau smiled. "Perhaps this is a good thing. Charles is making an enemy of the British, specifically the Royal Navy. This arrogant fellow will get what he deserves." Brian nodded slowly. Challenging the world's #1 navy wasn't something a few planes could accomplish. What they didn't know was that the one currently overwhelmed and unable to sleep for days wasn't Charles, but the Royal Navy, whom they regarded as a godlike entity. Perhaps due to absolute confidence in the Royal Navy, or perhaps to push Charles to the front lines against the Royal Navy as quickly as possible, Parliament approved Vice Admiral Gappert's application in just 2 days. Meanwhile, after Charles confirmed with Joka, the first batch of funds, $3 million, arrived that same day, and even the steel needed for shipbuilding was sourced from the United States. Note, the journey from New York to Brest takes only about a week, transportation costs are low, and with a devaluation of the French currency and soaring prices, importing steel from the US is cheaper than buying it domestically. Thus, the construction of the destroyer was accelerated at an unprecedented pace. At the Antwerp Airport Command Center, Charles received a special guest that day. This guest was mysterious. Charles knew nothing about him. The order came from a telegram sent the previous night by War Minister Gallieni. "Someone wants to speak with you tomorrow morning. Make sure to prepare for the reception and maintain secrecy. No one except you should know about this meeting." Who could it be? Charles wondered. Who else would need this level of secrecy for a meeting? However, Charles didn't dwell on it, simply instructing his guards not to let outsiders near the airport. Sometimes, the higher the level of secrecy, the more likely it is to leak information. For example, suddenly increasing patrols, conducting a thorough search of the surrounding area, or raising the level of airport security. These mere movements can alert spies to the arrival of a high-ranking official, allowing them to prepare in advance. Charles didn't take the matter to heart, forgetting about it completely the next morning, and went about his usual routine of reviewing documents after breakfast. As he signed the documents, he pondered, what kind of anti-aircraft firepower should be installed on the new destroyer? Should he get the Bofors anti-aircraft guns and install them? That didn't seem right. He now possessed air superiority. Developing such a medium-range anti-aircraft weapon would be like making things difficult for himself. No, he should proceed slowly. He should develop step by step, like a Russian nesting doll, so that he could always keep Britain under his control. At that moment, a guard stepped forward to report, "General, someone wants to see you." He says he's Lieutenant Colonel Fernand. Charles was taken aback. Lieutenant Colonel Fernand? Could he be the mysterious guest Galini had mentioned? Charles smiled and ordered, "Let him in." He considered it a prank. Soon, Lieutenant Colonel Fernand appeared at the office door, accompanied by several men whose uniforms and attire suggested they were his guards and staff officers. Charles smiled and rose to greet him, expecting Lieutenant Colonel Fernand to greet him casually as usual. Unexpectedly, Lieutenant Colonel Fernand looked around nervously, then lowered his voice and leaned closer to Charles, saying, "Someone needs to see you alone, Lieutenant General." With that, Lieutenant Colonel Fernand stepped aside, revealing a staff officer with a grizzled mustache to Charles. The staff officer looked Charles over with interest, smiled slightly, and greeted him in Russian, "Hello, it's a pleasure to meet you, Lieutenant General Charles." Charles immediately realized that this staff officer was the guest. He was Russian, and his rank must be quite high. Charles thought, he must be very important, otherwise he wouldn't be worried about being assassinated by spies. Sure enough, when Charles, his staff officer, and the translator were in the conference room, the translator introduced them. "Lieutenant General, this is General Brusilov. He is very interested in your armored penetration tactics." The image above shows General Brusilov, chief of the General Staff of Tsarist Russia. The only major victory on the Eastern Front was the Brusilov offensive he commanded, which nearly crushed the Austro-Hungarian Empire. "It's a pleasure to meet you, General," Charles said, stepping forward to shake hands with Brusilov. Brusilov seemed unsmiling. He nodded at Charles. "I heard you're only 19? I'm curious, how did you come up with those tactics that should only be summarized after countless battles?" Then Brusilov gave examples. "For instance, the reverse slope tactic you used at Verdun. It was a very bold innovation. Almost no one would willingly give up the high ground, which was originally a tactical and even strategic location that everyone was desperately fighting for. Tactics are about the battle itself. Being on high ground means having a commanding position, which means having a geographical advantage over the enemy. Strategy refers to the impact on a campaign. Several commanding heights can provide intelligence to the entire army, and holding them can delay enemy movements, like driving in a few nails. Indeed, as General Brusilov said, many battles in this era revolve around the struggle for commanding heights. "That's because I treat war like a game, General," Charles replied, half-jokingly. "There are many things we haven't thought of because we take it too seriously, always thinking that failure will cost us blood, lives, even the survival of a nation. But if you treat it like a game, you'll find there are many things you can try, and are worth trying." Brusilov paused, then laughed. "You're absolutely right. The battlefield certainly needs this kind of playful mentality." Chapter 655 Adapting to Local Conditions. "I've come here to learn from you about tank development and tactics," Brusilov said directly and sincerely. Officers who have experienced the battlefield often possess this quality. This is because they have faced life and death, knowing that in the face of victory and defeat on the battlefield, the face that ordinary people care about is insignificant. "You know," Brusilov sighed softly, "our army's performance on the Eastern Front has been terrible. No matter how much geographical and numerical superiority we have, our casualty ratio against the enemy is around 5-1, sometimes even worse, even against the Austro-Hungarian army. The Austro-Hungarian army was far less effective than the German army, yet the Tsarist Russian army still crumbled and disorganized in the face of their attacks." Brusilov looked up and stared directly into Charles's eyes. "But you. To be precise, it's you, Lieutenant General Charles, who managed to defeat the German army with far fewer troops. You infiltrated Antwerp and captured over 100,000 Germans in one fell swoop, then infiltrated Hasselt and captured over 200,000 more. Sometimes I wonder if our army could do something similar. Of course, Charles replied confidently. You just need to find the enemy's weakness. I know, Brusilov said, a hint of helplessness in his eyes. I've studied your tactics, Lieutenant General Charles, for a long time now, ever since you successfully held off the German advance in Ypres. That was at least a year ago. Charles had almost forgotten it. We've even developed our own tanks. With that, Brusilov turned to the translator. The translator understood and immediately took out a blueprint and instruction manual from his briefcase, respectfully handing it to Charles. Charles took it and saw a tank he had never seen before. Perhaps it was because it couldn't be called a tank. The image above shows the Tsar tank developed by Tsarist Russia. It features large front wheels and is 9 meters high. The Russians attempted to use these large wheels to cross trenches and obstacles, but when a prototype was produced in August 1915, they discovered that while the large wheels could indeed cross, the smaller rear wheels would get stuck, rendering the tank immobile. It was ultimately abandoned. Charles glanced at it and immediately pointed out the tank's weakness. Aren't you worried that the huge front wheels will become targets for enemy infantry artillery? The larger the wheels, the larger the target, and the easier it is for the enemy to hit them. Moreover, they are wheels, the support and the means by which the tank moves. Such a significant weakness is right in front of the enemy. A single shot could cripple or even overturn it. I really don't know how this design passed. Brusilov nodded and sighed. It has been proven that your Charoller A1 is the best design, and it's still relevant even now. However, our transport routes to Europe are basically blocked, making it difficult for us to import this tank from your country. This was the Minister of Munitions' fault. His arrogance led him to provoke the Ottoman Empire from the outset, resulting in heavy losses and the disruption of the most important shipping route from Europe to Russia. Another route was through the North Sea into the Arctic Ocean and then to Russia. However, the North Sea was blockaded by German submarines, and more importantly, the Arctic Ocean was frozen for about 6 months of the year, November to April of the following year. Even when it thawed, it was riddled with icebergs, making transport extremely dangerous and limiting capacity. As a result, Tsarist Russia was essentially isolated and without support. Brusilov took a sip of his coffee and said worriedly, the situation on the Eastern Front is very pessimistic, Lieutenant General. We could collapse at any moment. I'm thinking, could you design a tank for us, a tank that can be mass-produced quickly without incurring too much cost? This could be a great help. Only with such a tank could he build an armored force like Charles, and replicate Charles's tactics and apply them to the battlefield. Finally, Brusilov added, this would be beneficial to the Western Front, and it's in the interest of France, and even you. I believe you would be willing to help, wouldn't you? This was indeed in France's interest. Germany's current policy is West first, then East. Falkenhayn intends to defeat France first before focusing all its efforts on Tsarist Russia. The reason is that Tsarist Russia is large and powerful. Even with a 5-1 casualty ratio, it would be difficult to defeat in a short time, and no one expected Tsarist Russia to collapse from within. For France, helping Russia achieve victory on the Eastern Front, or at least hold out longer, would indeed relieve pressure on its defensive lines. However, Charles pondered for a moment, then shook his head. It's not that I'm unwilling to help you, General, but I don't think you need tanks. Besides, even if you had tanks, it would be difficult to achieve the same kind of penetration as my army. Why? Brusilov asked, puzzled. Terrain, climate, and transportation, General, Charles replied. I wonder if you've considered that the weather in Russia is much colder than here. Its winters have thick snow layers, unsuitable for rapid tank penetration. Charles turned his gaze to Brusilov. Brusilov was taken aback, then nodded in agreement. In Russia, snow depths of up to half a meter are common in winter, and in extreme cases, they can reach tens of meters in some areas, making rapid tank penetration extremely difficult. Charles continued, after spring, the melting snow will create large areas of flooding, turning many regions into swamps, and the roads will become muddy. Furthermore, your railway lines are far fewer than France's, making logistical support impossible. Under these circumstances, even if tanks successfully penetrated to their designated positions, they might be surrounded and annihilated by the enemy due to logistical difficulties. The success of German encirclement and penetration tactics during World War II stemmed from exploiting the window of opportunity before winter. After the onset of winter, before achieving final victory, the tide began to turn in the enemy's favor. At this time, Tsarist Russia lacked the organizational, logistical, and reconnaissance capabilities to replicate the German encirclement and penetration tactics, ultimately failing miserably. Brusilov's expression grew increasingly serious. "You're quite right, Lieutenant General. You have a thorough understanding of the Russian terrain and situation, but isn't there any other way?" Charles calmly replied, "Of course there is, General. There's always a way. I think you shouldn't always be thinking about tanks, but should leverage your own strengths." Brusilov looked bewildered. "Our strengths?" He could only think of weaknesses. At this moment, the Russian army's confidence and morale were in a state of collapse. But Charles answered with certainty, "Yes, our strengths, numbers and familiarity with the terrain." Chapter 656 Multiple Breakthroughs, One Focus. Brusilov shook his head slightly, a hint of embarrassment in his voice. "I don't think this is an advantage, Lieutenant General. We do have a large number of troops, but their combat effectiveness is questionable. There's a saying, quality over quantity, and at this moment, the Russian army was numerous but not skilled, a major military blunder. However, sometimes numerous but not skilled can also be an advantage, depending on how it's utilized and amplified." Charles placed the documents in his hand on the table. "If this is the German defense line, our objective is clear, to break through the enemy's lines and quickly penetrate to their rear, attacking their vulnerable supply lines." Brusilov agreed. He had studied Charles's infiltration tactics and knew its essence was using mobile forces. But a second later, he felt something was amiss. "That's why I need armored forces, Lieutenant General, yet you think our situation isn't suitable for them." "I didn't say armored forces," Charles replied. "Then what could it be?" "Cavalry, cavalry," Brusilov exclaimed, staring at Char in astonishment. "No, that's impossible, Lieutenant General. Cavalry would suffer heavy casualties under enemy machine gun fire." "Unbelievable. Char was actually proposing cavalry flanking maneuvers? Wasn't this the tactic he had rejected? And the enormous casualties incurred by cavalry on the Somme?" Char gently shook his head. "This might hold true elsewhere. With the advent of machine guns, cavalry should have been rendered obsolete, and with the advent of tanks, their role completely replaced. However, in Russia's unique climate and terrain, this was not the case. Even in World War II, the Soviet army maintained cavalry divisions, which played a significant role on the battlefield. Cavalry might be more useful than tanks in snow and mud, General, Charles said firmly. "I've heard you have horse-drawn sleds, so why not mount a Maxim machine gun on one?" Brusilov was momentarily stunned, then murmured after a long pause, Yes, sleds. Why don't we mount a Maxim machine gun on a sled?" "Good question." Charles grabbed a pen and paper and began to analyze as he drew. "The sled can't be too high, because that would make it unstable and prone to tipping over. Therefore, the height of the machine gun should not exceed that of the horse, which means the muzzle cannot be pointed forward." Charles drew a rearward-facing muzzle on the paper and continued, "But we can point the muzzle backward, so we can fire while moving. Of course, this requires some training. At other times, I mean when it's not snowing, we can convert it into a horse-drawn carriage." The image above shows a simple combination of a horse-drawn carriage and a Maxim machine gun, commonly known as a Tachanka, an important weapon widely used by both the Soviet and Russian armies. Brusilov stared at the drawing by Char, speechless for a long while before nodding in approval. "This seems better than I imagined, Lieutenant General. This might be exactly what we need, because it doesn't require funding. I mean, it only needs a wagon and a machine gun. We can equip it in large quantities quickly." Char handed the completed sketch to Brusilov, reminding him, "It shouldn't charge the enemy. General, the gun barrel is at the rear, and the horses are vulnerable in front. You should suddenly turn the horses around outside the enemy's rifle range and spray fire with a machine gun. The Maxim machine gun has a longer range than a rifle, and its high rate of fire creates a wide area of fire. This could be surprisingly effective in skirmishes and on the battlefield." "Of course," Brusilov nodded heavily. "Most importantly, it's about maneuver warfare," Char added. "You can imagine a wagon like this encountering an infantry company or even more enemies in an open area." Brusilov was stunned. A wagon with only 3 men and a machine gun, what could they do against an infantry company besides run away? Suddenly, he understood. The wagon could maintain distance from the enemy, always within the range of the Maxim machine guns but outside the range of the enemy rifles, and ultimately, this wagon might even wipe out an entire infantry company. "Unbelievable." Brusilov stared blankly at Charles. "It's practically designed for us, though not perfect, it's the most suitable." Charles turned his gaze back to the German defense line. "With such equipment, plus elite cavalry and infantry, we can quickly break through the enemy's defenses and attack their rear, just like my infiltration operations. But Brusilov had reservations. He hesitated and said, "I've done it before, Lieutenant General, perhaps because the Germans have had the experience of being successfully infiltrated by you. They've formed mobile units on the second line. Once my troops break through somewhere, their mobile units will immediately arrive and fill the gap. This is one of the disadvantages of cavalry breakthroughs. The characteristic of armor breakthroughs is speed. The enemy's mobile units cannot stop them in time, and even if mobile units arrive, they cannot withstand the powerful combat force of the armored units and are quickly crippled and unable to stop them. Cavalry's combat and defensive capabilities are far inferior to armored units, making them easily bogged down by mobile forces. The result is that the enemy's numbers escalate, eventually becoming blocked and unable to penetrate. However, Charles had considered this, and he calmly said, "That's why I said we should utilize the advantage of numerical superiority." Brusilov looked bewildered. What did numerical superiority have to do with this? Charles pointed his pen along the border of the document representing the German defensive line. "You have numerical superiority, General. Using this, you can simultaneously concentrate large forces in several directions to break through several different positions on the enemy's lines. For example, this, and this." Brusilov's expression turned serious. The Russian army's logistical support and combat capabilities might only be able to support one breakthrough. But the next second, his eyes lit up. "The Lieutenant General means that all the other breakthroughs are feints, and only one is real." Charles inwardly praised him. As expected of Brusilov, he understood so quickly. But this wasn't surprising. This was the tactic Brusilov pioneered during World War I, multiple breakthroughs, one is the primary focus. This tactic is well suited for infiltration units with insufficient combat strength. Simultaneous breakthroughs at multiple points aim to confuse the Germans, making it difficult for them to distinguish between real and feint attacks, thus leaving their second-line mobile forces uncertain about where to support. Focusing on one key point means waiting until the German second-line mobile forces are tied down before suddenly launching an infiltration. By then, the Germans will lack a second-line mobile force or sufficient mobile forces to block them. Finally, Charles added, "I think you can choose to launch the attack in June, because at that time," Brusilov interrupted, his tone full of excitement and joy, "the snow will melt, creating swamps everywhere, and there will be many mosquitoes. Such climate and environment are unsuitable for German operations and for the movement of mobile forces." Chapter 657 Because France has Charles. Brusilov thanked Char profusely and left satisfied. Just outside the command post, his translator and staff officer, who had accompanied him the entire time, asked doubtfully, "General, do you trust Char's tactics? He didn't seem to give us anything, just a few suggestions." Their original purpose for the trip was to receive a tank design and accompanying tactics from Char, but this goal had clearly not been achieved. In the staff officer's view, the suggestion of sleds, wagons, and Maxim tanks, while good, was still difficult to counter the German tanks, and he couldn't help but feel somewhat disappointed. Brusilov smiled slightly. "That's enough." He didn't say much more. Staff officers and ordinary people always hope to possess seemingly advanced equipment and use it to achieve victory. But Brusilov understood that often, it was the extremely simple equipment like sleds, wagons, and Maxim tanks, equipped to be deployed in large numbers quickly, that was more lethal. Consider this: how many tanks could the Germans have on the Eastern Front? The Russian army could instantly equip itself with tens of thousands of wagons and Maxim tanks. Once an attack was launched, it would surely overwhelm the Germans from both sides. Stepping out of the airport and into the car heading to the dock, Brusilov thoughtfully remarked to his staff officer, "The only thing I'm not entirely sure about is Charles's tactic of replacing armored troops with cavalry for infiltration. After all, there's the precedent of the failed battle at the Somme, and horses, being flesh and blood, are unlikely to withstand enemy fire. However, perhaps the Russian climate and environment are indeed, as he says, worth a try." The staff officer agreed. The Eastern Front was on the verge of collapse. What else could they do but try Charles's tactics? Wait to die? It was better to try anything, even if it seemed hopeless. Brusilov glanced back at the airport through the car window. He had heard that Charles had recently been at odds with the Royal Navy. Not long ago, he had thought Charles was arrogant and courting disaster, but now it seemed more likely that the Royal Navy, not Charles, was heading towards its doom. The car accelerated with the roar of its engine, the cold wind whistling in through the windows. Brusilov asked the staff officer abruptly, "Do you know why we're so eager to join this war, Vladimirovich?" The staff officer paused, then shook his head slightly. It was indeed strange. This world war had little to do with Russia, yet Russia was the first to issue a national mobilization order. 48 hours after Austria-Hungary declared war, Russia had increased its active duty forces by 900,000 and conscripted another 4 million reserves. Meanwhile, Britain and France were still observing. It wasn't until a dozen days later that France had mustered an army of 1.4 million, while Britain had only organized a 70,000-strong expeditionary force. "Because we believe Britain can win the war," Brusilov replied in a deep voice. "Side by her, and you'll always win, understand?" The staff officer nodded in understanding. 200 years ago, Peter the Great personally led a delegation to the Netherlands and Britain to learn shipbuilding. He learned not only the technology but also witnessed Britain's power, and his thoughts and politics were deeply influenced by it, even to this day. But Brusilov sighed softly and murmured, "Now, it seems we need to change our thinking. A different approach." He didn't say it explicitly. However, the staff officer understood, given the current situation, Russia should follow France's lead rather than Britain's. Because France had Charles, while Britain had fallen behind. In the afternoon, Charles took a nap in the lounge. The French didn't have the habit of taking afternoon naps, and Charles, as a commander, usually didn't have time for one either. But perhaps due to genetics, Charles often felt sleepy around this time when he had free time, and he couldn't work efficiently without a rest. When he got up, he was surprised to see Tijani already sitting in his office. "Why are you here?" Charles asked. During this period, Tijani was stationed in Namur, commanding the armored corps, and occasionally participating in a few small-scale battles for training. Charles found it strange. He should have at least sent a telegram to explain before coming. Unexpectedly, Tijani nodded towards Charles's desk. "The telegram was sent this morning. You don't seem to have had time to read it." Charles then remembered that he had been busy receiving Brusilov all morning. Receiving Brusilov was not as simple as it seemed. It wasn't just about relieving pressure on the Western Front. Charles was also planning for the future confrontation with Britain. The main members of the Entente powers were Britain, France, and Russia. If he could get Russian support in the confrontation with the British Royal Navy, or if Russia remained neutral, it would be a huge help to Charles. "Speak." Charles sat down at his desk and asked, "What brings you to Antwerp?" "Not to observe a naval battle, is it?" Charles was joking. Although Tijani was Welles's son and had a strong inclination to study the art of war, he had a strong aversion to the Navy. "The Navy has no aesthetic appeal whatsoever," Tijani commented on it. "They compete on who has the thickest armor and the biggest gun caliber. As for command, it's just firing." Charles could understand this guy's thinking. He preferred the dynamism and innovation of the battlefield, but the Navy during World War I offered little in the way of change or innovation, especially with the Royal Navy consistently dominating the French Navy and preventing it from ever gaining prominence. Thus, it appeared both uninteresting and monotonous to him. Furthermore, at least part of the reason was that Welles's childhood pressure on Tijani to join the Navy instilled in him a strong subconscious rebellious streak. "I realize I was wrong." Tijani sat down across from Charles. "Naval warfare isn't as boring as I thought." Charles stared blankly at Tijani. "You mean, you're planning to join the Naval Command?" Tijani replied helplessly, "I heard you're planning to invest in building 10 destroyers, Vice Admiral. Guess who the Brest shipyard will send to discuss the new destroyer construction plan with you?" Charles glanced at Tijani. "It won't be you, will it?" Tijani shrugged, then stood up and spun around with a touch of narcissism. "Besides me, do you think there's anyone more suitable?" Charles shook his head dismissively. "When there are no great generals in Shu, Liao Hua becomes the vanguard." "What?" Tijani asked. "Who's Liao Hua?" "Nothing." Charles brushed it off. But thinking about it more closely, it seemed that no one was more suitable than Tijani. This guy was the heir apparent of the Brest shipyard, and no one could match his credibility. At the same time, he had been by Charles's side for a long time, commanding operations, and their familiarity was unparalleled. More importantly, he learned advanced tactical concepts from Charles, making communication with Charles much smoother. Furthermore, Welles was intentionally grooming this successor. Charles sighed inwardly. The resources available to the rich second generation were indeed unparalleled by ordinary people. Chapter 658 New Type of Destroyer. The standard displacement of the destroyer we're going to build is initially set at 1,400 tons, said Charles. The full load displacement will be around 2,000 tons, which can be adjusted as needed. Tycoon, taking notes in his notebook, said, "Why don't we just build cruisers with a standard displacement of around 4,000 tons? The larger the displacement, the more powerful the firepower, and it's even cheaper." As the crown prince of the Brest shipyard, Tycoon knew that tonnage and price were not simply proportional. Often, the larger the tonnage, the lower the average cost. "Speed, General," Charles replied simply. At the same level of technology and industry, larger tonnage generally means slower speed. Speed. Tycoon stopped writing, looked up at Charles with a puzzled expression. "If we already have airplanes, airplanes armed with torpedoes, why do we still need to emphasize the speed of destroyers?" Charles countered. "Does that mean that on land, with aircraft cover, tanks don't need speed?" Tycoon hesitated for a moment, then said reluctantly, "But that seems different from tanks. Tanks have numbers to cover them, and many ways to evade attacks, but warships are few in number, and at sea, they have no way to avoid aircraft." Charles continued, "What if the enemy uses torpedo boats or destroyers, small but fast vessels, to surround us? Should we also choose to use aircraft armed with torpedoes to sink them?" Tycoon was speechless. Sinking a destroyer might be possible, but torpedo boats are too fast to be hit by torpedoes, and even if they were, it wouldn't be worth it. Charles continued his analysis. "Any operation should be systematic, General. In the past, naval warfare consisted of torpedo boats, destroyers, cruisers, and battleships. They cooperated and coordinated to form a powerful fighting force, but our new destroyers are not just destroyers, they are meant to break this old system and form a new combat system." Tycoon considered for a moment, his face showing uncertainty. "You mean, a new system formed by destroyers and aircraft?" "Yes," Charles replied. "The two cooperate with each other, rather than hindering each other. This requires both to have self-defense capabilities and not become weak points that can be picked off one by the enemy." Tycoon understood. Aircraft have self-defense capabilities. They can fly out of enemy fire at any time and find a suitable opportunity to rejoin the battle. But warships are not like that. Charles nodded. "The self-defense capability of warships is also speed." "You are right," Tycoon readily admitted his mistake. "Therefore, the tonnage of a warship is determined by the current level of technology and the speed of the enemy's warships. If the enemy's destroyers have a speed of around 33 knots, our destroyers must at least have that speed. With a speed of 33 knots and the aid of aerial reconnaissance, a destroyer could completely ignore battleships with speeds of around 90 knots, as they would never be able to catch up with a destroyer. Cruisers with speeds of around 29 knots could also be largely ignored. Therefore, on the open ocean, a destroyer would only face enemy destroyers, or, when entering enemy coastal waters, torpedo boats. Understanding this makes things much easier. Because our main adversary is enemy destroyers, we still need plenty of guns, initially set at 4 130mm main guns. This was determined by the fact that enemy destroyers' firepower and dive bombers had not yet been developed at this time. New destroyers could not be equipped with only 1 or 2 guns like modern destroyers. In addition, we will add 2 triple torpedo launchers. Most destroyers at this time used twin torpedo launchers. Charles used triple launchers to increase the number of torpedoes launched at once, thus maximizing the strike capability of the new torpedoes. 2 depth charge rails. With 22 bombs, Charles intentionally reduced the anti-submarine warfare requirements of the destroyer. The reason was that the main adversary of the French fleet was not the German Navy but the British Royal Navy. On the other hand, the Charles's new destroyer was designed for mobile warfare, maneuvering at 33 knots rather than escorting. World War I submarines, with surface speeds of around 10 knots and underwater speeds of only 8 to 10 knots, posed no threat to this warship. Tycoon noted these points down. Though he had some doubts about anti-submarine warfare, he didn't ask further. After a moment's thought, he asked, "I heard that our new warship is mainly for anti-aircraft defense, but so far, I haven't seen any anti-aircraft firepower." Charles took a blueprint from a drawer and handed it to Tycoon. "For anti-aircraft firepower, use this machine gun, 20mm caliber, 20mm caliber." Tycoon asked doubtfully, "The German Becker gun?" But after taking Charles's blueprint, he realized that the machine gun on the drawing was somewhat different from the Becker gun. The general structure was the same, but the barrel was longer and thinner. The image above shows the prototype of the Oerlikon machine gun, invented by the German Becker, hence its name. Initially used by the Germans on aircraft, it was quickly shot down and captured by the Allied powers. Its key feature was its innovative pre-firing recoil system, which reduced recoil and led to its widespread use in anti-aircraft and aircraft cannons. The image above shows the Oerlikon machine gun widely used on warships. Charles merely showed the blueprints to Tigany before taking them back, instead handing over a data file. "I'll be in charge of the machine gun's production," Charles said. "You just need to know these data and reserve gun positions on its sides." The use of this machine gun for anti-aircraft purposes wasn't exactly a secret, but Charles's improved version of the Oerlikon 20mm machine gun was. It had a higher rate of fire and muzzle velocity than the original Becker, with significantly improved performance, something not easily revealed. Charles planned to have the gun produced at the artillery factory in Darvez. Charles believed that anything related to maintaining balance in their own equipment should be handled with utmost caution. For example, this Oerlikon cannon shot down in nearly 30% of aircraft during World War II. Furthermore, it could also serve as an aircraft cannon. One day, simply mounting it on an aircraft to strafe tanks could easily penetrate their top armor, turning it into a ground attack aircraft. Tigany, of course, understood the implications. He nodded in understanding. "Understood, Lieutenant General. If it were me, I would do everything in my power to keep it a secret. After all, you're inventing equipment to fight your own equipment." Then he laughed. "That must be exhausting. I mean, becoming your own adversary." Charles sighed inwardly. This situation was inevitable when inventing a certain amount of equipment. Now, he could only hope that the enemy wouldn't quickly replicate it and feed back to him. Chapter 659 Stokes' Dilemma. The blueprints and data that Charles provided to Tigany were for the Astute-class destroyers, developed by France 9 years later. All other specifications were the same, except that the two single-barreled 37mm anti-aircraft guns were replaced with 10 20mm autocannons. Although construction began in 1925, the two 37mm guns used were what was known as French hand-operated guns, with a maximum rate of fire of only 30 rounds per minute and an actual rate of fire of less than 15 rounds per minute. Note, the Astute class was built shortly after the end of World War I, and the French Navy lacked awareness of air defense, thus neglecting anti-aircraft firepower. The two 37mm anti-aircraft guns were merely for contingency purposes, better than nothing. In contrast, the Oerlikon 20mm autocannons had an actual rate of fire of 320 rounds per minute. As is well known, air defense relies on hitting targets with a barrage of fire. Rate of fire means high accuracy. Therefore, Charles did not hesitate to replace them with Oerlikon guns to improve its air defense capabilities. The image above shows the French Astute-class destroyer, laid down in 1925, with a standard displacement of 1,380 tons, a full displacement of 2,000 tons, and a speed of 33 knots. In London, England, Stokes walked home as usual after get-off work. This wasn't because Stokes was trying to save money, but because he had a long-standing habit of thinking while walking. The prototype of the mortar was conceived during one of these walks. Now, he was thinking about the task Charles had given him, to shorten a breech block and produce a dedicated tank gun. This was no easy task, because the breech block had a hydraulic recoil and return mechanism, and shortening it almost meant optimizing the entire mechanism, except for the gun barrel. During this period, Stokes' mind was filled with various improvement and optimization schemes, sometimes even in his dreams. The headache was that the laboratory was in France, while Stokes and his mechanical company were in England, forcing Stokes to communicate by telegram every day. This took more than an hour, and many problems arose due to poor communication and unclear expression. As Stokes walked with his head down, he suddenly sensed something was wrong. It seemed someone was following him. This thought sent chills down his spine. In this war-torn era, it wouldn't be unusual for someone to pull out a pistol and point it at the back of his head. To confirm this, Stokes quickened his pace and turned into a side street ahead, then pretended to take shelter and light a cigarette, waiting for a moment. Sure enough, a man wearing a top hat and a black cloak quickly caught up. He paused abruptly upon seeing Stokes right in front of him, then casually glanced left and right before continuing on his way. Stokes hurriedly changed direction and headed towards his villa, his pace quickening. The man followed closely behind, stopping only after Stokes entered the villa, but lingering outside the door for a long time. Once inside, Stokes didn't immediately remove his top hat. Instead, He went to the window and peeked through a corner, seeing the man in black constantly peering into the house. He became increasingly certain that he was in danger. Seeing Stokes's actions as he set the table, his wife asked in confusion, "What happened, Stokes?" Stokes hesitated, unsure whether he should tell his wife, worried it might frighten her. However, if she knew nothing, she might be unprepared for potential danger. Thinking this, Stokes carefully helped his wife to a chair and lowered his voice, saying, "Don't worry, Lola, there's something I think you should know." "What?" His wife looked at Stokes with a puzzled expression. She had never seen her husband look like this, not even when German airships flew over London. Stokes hesitated again for a moment before making up his mind. "We're being followed." His wife was taken aback, then laughed. "Aren't you being paranoid? It could just be a coincidence." No, Stokes quickly explained, "It's true, believe me. And I might know why." "Why?" his wife asked suspiciously. "Who have you offended?" Stokes was well liked. Such a thing was unusual for him. "I might," Stokes sighed softly, "I might have offended the British government." His wife's mouth hung open, unable to close, and after a long while, she asked in surprise, What did you say?" "The British government." "Listen to me, Laura," Stokes explained, "I didn't expect this. I'm working with Charles, as I have told you, and others know, and I think the British government knows about it too, but this." Then his wife understood. "You mean, you're working with Charles on some kind of invention?" Stokes nodded. His wife asked again, "Some important, unknown invention?" Stokes nodded again. "About military equipment," Stokes admitted helplessly. "Yes, just like you think." His wife's face paled instantly. "You're crazy, Stokes. You're English, I know," Stokes replied, his voice tense and flustered. "But the idea is Charles's. In principle, it's his invention. I'm just helping him realize it. I think it's just a business. Besides, Britain and France are allies, aren't they?" "I don't think this will be okay. It's legal," his wife interrupted him, her eyes filled with terror. "They don't care about legality. They certainly don't want France to surpass Britain. Never." "You're right, but what can I do now?" Stokes slumped, holding his head in frustration. "Turn myself in." The next second, Stokes rejected the idea. "No, they don't want me to turn myself in. They want what Charles and I are developing." "So, they'll want me to become a spy?" Stokes shook his head in distress. He was a businessman. He didn't want to be embroiled in such complicated relationships and live a life of constant fear. His wife considered for a moment, then suggested, "Why don't you ask Charles? If this is a collaboration between Charles and you, then he should be responsible for it. Or, you could choose to withdraw from this project." Stokes' eyes lit up. Yes, withdrawing from the project would eliminate all worries. But Stokes hesitated as soon as he stood up. Machinery companies were struggling during wartime. Rising prices for raw materials like steel had brought them to the brink of bankruptcy. This project with Charles involved producing tank cannons. All tanks would need tank cannons in the future, potentially granting him wealth he could never spend in several lifetimes. Withdrawing meant getting nothing and simply waiting for bankruptcy. Chapter 660 Changes in the Somme River. At the Antwerp Airport Command Post, Charles and Tigny engaged in a heated debate about the tactics of the new destroyer. The focus was on the future development of the destroyer. Charles believed that future destroyers should be further reduced in weight, with the main guns reduced to one aft and one forward, using the freed up weight and space to increase anti-aircraft firepower. Tigny vehemently opposed this. "We're discussing the future, Vice Admiral. Perhaps your torpedo bombers can threaten all the warships, and I've heard about the idea of bombers carrying bombs. I admit they're all feasible. But have you considered that aircraft have limited range? You can't control every sea area with aircraft." Tigny pointed heavily into the depths of the Atlantic Ocean. "Besides, even if your aircraft could arrive, how long would it take at aircraft speed? An hour? 2 hours, Charles countered. "Why can't we have the fleet carry aircraft?" "You mean seaplanes?" Tigny dismissed the idea without hesitation. "Seaplanes have limited uses, Vice Admiral. I'm talking about wheeled aircraft." Charles interrupted Tigny. "We can build a ship, construct a runway on it, and wheeled aircraft can take off from the warship, and of course, land." Tigny stared in disbelief, then shook his head incredulously. "That's absurd, Vice Admiral. It's impossible." "Really?" Charles asked calmly. "But as far as I know, the British have already done it, and even achieved partial success." Tigny froze. You're telling the truth." "Of course," Charles replied. A few months ago, a British-wheeled aircraft successfully took off from HMS Furious. It was only partially successful because it couldn't land on the warship. It had to return to land after completing its mission. This was why HMS Furious couldn't be considered the first aircraft carrier. Ultimately, the United States beat them to it and successfully completed the takeoff and landing. At that time, only Britain and the United States had the funds to continue such experiments. Seeing Digenie's continued skepticism, Charles added, "Don't doubt it, General. Small aircraft only need a runway of a few dozen meters to take off. It's feasible for warships to provide a takeoff platform. It's just that you can hardly imagine the Navy having such equipment." Britain and the United States hadn't made the relevant experiments public. At that time, this information was still a military secret. Moreover, Charles believed that Britain and the United States would accelerate the development of aircraft carriers. Because fighter jets launched from aircraft carriers are the best and most effective way to counter Char's torpedo bombers. Digenie stared blankly at Char, then suddenly exclaimed, "God, I must tell Vice Admiral Jeplet about this." He turned and rushed downstairs. This was no small matter. A new era of naval warfare was likely dawning, faster than anyone anticipated. At that moment, a staff officer handed Char a telegram. It was a private matter, from Stokes. Stokes' anxiety was palpable in the telegram. "Lieutenant General, I've run into some trouble. I hope you can help me clarify things. The British government may consider me a traitor. You know, our collaborative project is related to the military industry, and I am British." Charles smiled slightly and calmly replied, "I would very much like to help you, Mr. Stokes. But given the current situation, don't you think I might make things worse? If you really want me to do so, I can clarify to the British government that I've even had some degree of cooperation with the Minister of Munitions, but I can't guarantee what the consequences will be." In London, England, Stokes, restless and anxious in his villa, was stunned when he received the telegram. Charles was right. Charles was French, and the person Britain feared most. Would his clarification be of any use? Not only would it be useless, it would only make things worse. It was a desperate measure. But what else could he do now? Soon after, Stokes received another telegram from Charles. "I think you now only have two paths, either withdraw from the project and tell the British government everything you know, but in the Darvaz laboratory, I can only offer it as compensation for your breach of contract, or persist in the project, no matter what difficulties you encounter." The words weren't explicitly stated, but Stokes understood. These two paths essentially meant either completely siding with Britain or completely siding with France. There was no third option. Withdraw from the project and give up the laboratory? No, then he would have nothing. So there was only. "I understand, Lieutenant General," Stokes replied. "I know what to do." At the Antwerp command post, Charles raised an eyebrow and put the telegram in his pocket. Actually, the CIA wasn't very interested in Stokes. At this time, the British government didn't value tank guns and didn't understand their importance. Therefore, the CIA didn't send anyone to track Stokes. Tracking Stokes and clumsily exposing himself was something Charles had to do. Only in this way could they completely force Stokes to France and become a member of the Bernard Group. Previously, Charles might not have needed to concern himself with Stokes and his mechanical company. But now, the production of Oerlikon anti-aircraft guns and aircraft cannons, and later various types of anti-aircraft guns, mostly modified from existing artillery, required mechanical experts rather than artillery experts. Entrusting these tasks to an Englishman was certainly inappropriate. But if that Englishman was a defector in France, it would be different. "General," a communications soldier standing at the radio shouted, reporting, "The Germans have counterattacked. On the north bank of the Somme, they have amassed a large number of armored units, and the British lines are about to collapse." Charles frowned. This seemed different from the historical Battle of the Somme. Historically, although the British suffered heavy casualties, their lines advanced slowly, and there was no instance of a complete collapse due to a German counterattack. What was happening now? He picked up a map, unfolded it on the table, and after considering it for a while, Charles seemed to understand. Historically, the British only advanced slowly after first deploying tanks in the Battle of the Somme. But now, because of the variable of the Charles, the evolution of British tanks has slowed down, and they are still using outdated turretless tanks like the Whippet. Meanwhile, the Germans, due to their battles with the Charles, have made significant progress in both tanks and tactics. Based on this, The Germans have the strength to defeat the British army, and the situation at the Battle of the Somme has changed. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 661, Bypassing Charles and Defeating the Enemy. Happy Chinese New Year. Wishing everyone a prosperous year of the snake. The young author sends New Year's greetings, wishing everyone smiles and good fortune. Under Charles's leadership, the freedom of navigation for the French Navy and merchant ships underwent a fundamental change, even a reversal. Before this, French ships had virtually no freedom in the Atlantic. They were practically under the control of the British Royal Navy. Britain, siding war, controlled traffic in most sea areas, especially the English Channel. Any ship passing through was subject to inspection and naval escort, including French merchant ships and the fleet. Britain's justification was that inspections were to prevent merchant ships from carrying contraband to Germany, and escorts were to prevent ships from accidentally entering minefields, all for the safety of all ships. These seemingly reasonable arguments actually disregarded France's territorial waters. If the British Royal Navy could do this, could the French Navy similarly blockade the channel facing France and inspect British merchant ships and the Royal Navy? Did the British Royal Navy also need the French Navy's consent and escort to pass through? The rights of both sides were equal. What the British Royal Navy could do, the French Navy could also do. But the French Parliament lacks such backbone. They assumed the Royal Navy was the world's best and believed the French Navy was invincible. Consequently, they not only failed to resist but also considered relocating the Brest shipyard and naval base to Tours. As a result, when Charles's forces reached Antwerp, the French Navy, despite having the capability to reinforce Antwerp, was still held back by the Royal Navy. All this changed under Charles's influence. Charles used the German Navy to contain the Royal Navy. Although there was no explicit agreement, a tacit understanding had been reached. The German Navy only attacked British convoys and merchant ships, ignoring merchant ships flying the French flag, even without escorts. Charles explained this by saying, "The Germans know that French destroyers can detect their submarines, and France also has torpedo bombers, so the Germans dare not act rashly." The French convoys reciprocated, remaining indifferent even when British merchant ships were attacked nearby and repeatedly cried for help. Charles offered even more compelling reasons. "Our warships need to protect our own merchant ships. We don't have enough spare vessels for rescue. Moreover, we're unsure if the Germans are using a diversionary tactic. They might attack French merchant ships while we're on our way to their aid. We must prioritize the interests of our own merchant ships before considering anything else. Any country would do the same." This infuriated the British Secretary of State for Munitions and the First Lord of the Admiralty, but they were powerless to do anything about it, not even able to voice their grievances. An alliance with the German Navy? Absolutely not. We were simply doing what we were supposed to do. The Royal Navy was the world's premier navy. You've always claimed you don't need the French Navy's intervention. The French Navy has only just gained the ability to defend itself and is not yet capable of helping the Royal Navy. Thus, a truly surreal scene unfolded in the Atlantic and North Sea. The Royal Navy, responsible for blockading the English Channel, continued its inspections, guidance, and escort duties, like a vigilante. Meanwhile, merchant ships from various countries paid protection money to France, joining Charles's escort fleet, because they knew only the French fleet could protect their safety. At the General Staff in Berlin, the map presented to Falkenhayn had expanded to include the North Sea. Originally, the North Sea wasn't something Chief of the General Staff Falkenhayn needed to consider, since he commanded the army and the German Navy had virtually no chance of involvement. But now the situation was different. The German Navy was becoming increasingly active, even threatening to overshadow the army. This could be seen as both good and bad for Falkenhayn. On the one hand, the Navy's activity relieved pressure on the army, especially since control of supplies had shifted to Charles, significantly weakening the British Expeditionary Force's fighting capacity. On the other hand, the Army's resources had been transferred to the Navy, with even newly developed bombers and their development teams being given to the Navy free of charge. Falkenhayn had originally planned to use them as a secret weapon to bomb Charles's airfields. Charles, unaware of the German bombers, was unprepared, and the sudden appearance of the bombers over their airfields could catch the French off guard, destroying a large number of Camel fighters. Then, Germany could potentially regain air superiority with its new aircraft. Now, all those dreams were shattered. "General, Colonel Irwin has arrived," a guard reported. Falkenhayn grunted and closed the file. "Take him to the conference room." "I'll wait for him there." "Yes, General." Only Falkenhayn and Colonel Irwin were in the large conference room. This time, Falkenhayn didn't summon Lieutenant General Nicholas. After reading the battle report, he felt that Lieutenant General Nicholas was the one who limited Colonel Irwin's effectiveness. In the Antwerp infiltration, Lieutenant General Nicholas insisted on using heavy forces to secure the flanks, which severely limited Colonel Irwin's forces for the infiltration. It turned out that Lieutenant General Nicholas's deployment had no effect. Charles's troops directly infiltrated Hasselt instead of returning to reinforce Antwerp. "I'm very sorry, General," Colonel Irwin said with a guilty expression. "I have failed your expectations." Falkenhayn raised his hand to stop Colonel Irwin from continuing. "I will not hold you responsible, Colonel," Falkenhayn said expressionlessly, his tone flat. "If I held every man defeated by the Charles accountable, Germany might have no officers left to command on the front lines." But Falkenhayn added, "However, there are no excuses on the battlefield, do you understand?" "Yes, General," Colonel Irwin replied, stepping forward. "Defeat is defeat, even against the Charles. The losses and responsibilities of defeat must still be borne." Falkenhayn gestured for Colonel Irwin to sit down opposite him and asked bluntly, "What's your plan?" Colonel Irwin's face showed a hint of helplessness. "I think it will be difficult for us to defeat Charles head-on. He is far superior to us in terms of strategy, equipment, and the quality of his armored corps. Trying to defeat him head-on would be humiliating, and even if we could, we would pay a heavy price." Falkenhayn's eyes held a hint of doubt. "You mean, we can bypass Charles and defeat the enemy?" "British, General," Colonel Irwin replied. "Charles' main force is in Belgium, facing the Liège fortress. He has nothing left to penetrate." Falkenhayn seemed to understand what Colonel Irwin meant. The Liège fortress was a bridgehead used by the Belgians to block the German army. It bordered the Dutch border to the north and the Ardennes forest to the south, making it difficult for Charles's armored corps to pose a threat. This allowed the German 1st Tank Division to break away and attack other positions. So, Falkenhayn's gaze turned to the map on the wall, finding the location of the Somme River. Chapter 662. The battlefield is a place where you can't see humanity. "You mean, launch a counter-offensive on the Somme?" Falkenhayn asked. "Have you considered that the advantage of defense is far greater than that of offense?" Falkenhayn was unaware of the principle of offense outweighing defense. He was more inclined to believe what he was seeing, wave after wave of British troops charging and falling to German machine guns. He worried that if the Germans launched a counter-offensive, this would happen to them. Colonel Irwin seemed to see through Falkenhayn's thoughts. He analyzed, "General, during the infiltration of Antwerp and the fighting against the British, I found that the British had almost no ability or tactics to stop tanks. I mean, although they are equipped with tanks, they only consider offense and not defense. I believe they have the same problem on the Somme." Irwin wasn't very confident about this. He had been stationed at the Liège fortress and hadn't had the opportunity to learn about the situation on the Somme. Falkenhayn countered, "What do you mean?" Irwin replied, "Anti-tank rifles, anti-tank ditches, anti-tank mines, and flexible defensive tactics." As he spoke, Irwin handed Falkenhayn a well-organized document from his briefcase. Falkenhayn opened the document. Each item was accompanied by a simple diagram, making it easy to understand at a glance. Colonel Irwin analyzed, "I believe this is due to the difference in the intensity of combat between the British and French armies. Since the start of the war, the main force fighting against our army has been the French army. Under the leadership of the military genius Charles, they have grown rapidly, and their equipment and combat theories are relatively mature and systematic. However, the British Expeditionary Force has been accumulating strength. The only large-scale battle they fought was the Battle of the Somme. In addition, the British stubbornness and arrogance have left their equipment and tactical theories relatively backward." Falkenhayn nodded as he flipped through the document. The methods of defending against tanks listed by Colonel Irwin were indeed something the British lacked, including those for the Somme defenses. In particular, the flexible defense tactics, which Charles used with his 6th Army, astonished the German generals. Everyone, including Falkenhayn, exclaimed in surprise, "So armored forces can be used like this? Germany should also learn this tactic, so they can defend longer lines with fewer troops. We need more tanks. Perhaps only this tactic can stop Charles's infiltration." Thus, The French and German armies learned these tank offensive and defensive tactics, while the British remained arrogant, believing themselves to be the world's leading power and not needing to learn from others, still using their old tactics. However, Fuckingham remained cautious, saying expressionlessly, "The British also have tanks, Colonel." Colonel Irwin was confident, "The British tanks are no match for you, General. We know how to deal with tanks without rotating turrets. Furthermore, we have upgraded our tanks. The British Whippet is just a pile of scrap metal in front of our new tanks." Colonel Irwin was referring to the German Lk-2 tank. The two images above show the Lk-1 and Lk-2 tanks. The biggest improvement is the change in the shape of the frontal armor, which makes it more defensive. Secondly, the rear of the hull has been changed from a square shape to a rhomboid shape, reducing the area exposed to bullets from the sides. The entire evolution process took only a little over 2 months. Fuckingham added, "They have more troops, Colonel. The British have at least 15 divisions there. We only have 8 divisions on the north bank of the Somme. Their forces are roughly half of the British." "I know, General," Colonel Irwin replied, "but we have tanks. In the face of tanks, having more troops also means more casualties, and I admit that might cause us a lot of trouble cleaning up the bodies." Fuckingham was silent for a moment, "But they also have artillery. The British have equipped themselves with new 152mm cannons, and they have stockpiled a large amount of shells, enough to blow all your tanks to smithereens." Colonel Irwin calmly replied, "Then we'll wait for them to launch their attack before counterattacking." Fuckingham instantly understood. The British tactics were rigid. They would unleash massive artillery barrages on the German lines before attacking, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. After this prolonged preparation, their ammunition would be nearly depleted, while waves of soldiers would surge forward. If a counterattack were launched at this point, the German tank-built steel lines would collide violently with the flesh and blood of the British soldiers. Fuckingham seemed to already see the horrific scene of corpses strewn across the battlefield. The north bank of the Somme was deafening with artillery fire. Inside the semi-buried forward command post of the British Expeditionary Force, loose soil swished and dripped from the ceiling through the gaps in the logs, a result of the artillery's vibrations. Haig glanced impatiently at the calendar on the table. It was turned to February 23rd. The artillery bombardment had continued for 3 days and 3 nights. Today was the planned day for the attack. Haig had lost interest in observing the German positions after the bombardment, because he knew it would be pointless. Each time, the German positions looked like ruins, uninhabitable, but the moment British soldiers stood on them, heads and dark gun barrels would spring up from the barren ground. Sometimes, Haig didn't know how to fight this battle. Should he try a flanking maneuver like Charles? No, the Somme's lines were so clearly defined there was no room for infiltration. Even Charles would be helpless on such a battlefield, Haig thought. "General," the staff officer reported, "there are over 300 deserters in the South African regiment." If it were just a few deserters, the staff officer wouldn't have reported it. It was too common. Haig gritted his teeth. These bastards, choosing to flee at the last moment of the attack, didn't they know this would be devastating to the morale of the troops? Without hesitation, Haig coldly ordered, "Drive them back to the battlefield." "Yes, sir." The staff officer turned and gave the order. Soon, a group of over 300 men were driven in 2s and 3s into the no-man's land between enemy and friendly forces, unarmed, under the guns of their comrades. Behind them, British officers brandished their pistols and shouted to their men, "This is the price of desertion. Remember this, they will die on the battlefield just as well, but as deserters, no honor or dignity, no compensation, everyone knows they are cowards." Gunfire erupted, and German soldiers, as if conducting target practice, mowed down the deserters one by one. Some panicked deserters tried to return to their trenches, but were shot down one by one by the prepared British soldiers on the snow. The British needed these deserters to charge forward, to fall under the German guns, so that they could find German firing positions. The battlefield is a place where humanity is invisible. Chapter 663 Tank Coordination. Before the deserters were wiped out, the British Army, under Haig's orders, launched an attack on the German lines. Leading the charge were Whippet tanks. Haig had once said, "Tanks and machine guns are useless, they are superfluous on the battlefield." He still held this view, only adding an explanation for his use of them, "But sometimes it doesn't prevent us from using superfluous things on the battlefield, like knights liking to use blood to outline patterns on their armor to show their bravery and achievements." The British soldiers knew what this meant, and they complained privately, The great butcher is showing off his stubbornness and stupidity twice again. Stubbornness and stupidity alone wouldn't be so bad, but he's also ruthless. Now, we can only pray to God. You think praying to God will help? Of course not. I'm praying I won't be his subordinate in the next life. This was the internal conflict within the British Expeditionary Force. Having experienced bloodshed and death on the battlefield, the soldiers fully understood the importance of machine guns and tanks, especially since the Germans had once killed 100,000 British soldiers in a single day with machine guns. They found it hard to believe that, after such a painful lesson, Haig would still insist on the uselessness of tanks and machine guns. The soldiers had no voice, they could only lament. If machine guns are useless, were the 100,000 corpses that fell on the battlefield fake? If tanks are useless, were the Charles's victories fake? Were the bullets they stopped fake? Even a fool knows they were useful. Only those hiding in command posts who don't go to the battlefield can ignore their existence. Haig's insistence on his views wasn't due to blindness or stupidity, he simply refused to face and admit his mistakes. And those who feign sleep can never be awakened. Because he was feigning sleep, Haig had to ignore tank tactics. All tank-related tactics, including combined arms tactics and tank defensive tactics. This is why the British Army's tactics consistently lagged behind those of France and Germany, even with tanks. The Whippet tank rumbled up the slope into the no-man's land. The Somme terrain was ideal for tank warfare, it was chalky, flat, and the only difficulty was the layers of overlapping shell craters. But this didn't stop the Whippet, which trudged along at a slow pace of 7 km per hour, its 4 machine guns on the turret bobbing rhythmically, almost being thrown off the vehicle. Behind it followed squads of British soldiers, their faces ashen, their eyes peering through the tank's exhaust fumes at the German trenches, their knuckles white from gripping their rifles too tightly. Some even had visibly trembling legs, falling several times only to be forcibly lifted up by their sympathetic comrades. "Follow the tanks," Captain Monty, commander of the 5th Infantry Brigade, shouted, waving his revolver. "Tanks can stop enemy machine gun fire, only by following them can we charge into the enemy trenches." This was Monty's 5th charge against the Germans. He believed tanks were simply bulletproof devices that could cover infantry as they advanced into trenches. Monty succeeded 3 times, solidifying his belief that his theory was correct. Sharing his success with others, he confidently declared, "Tanks and infantry simply need to do their jobs, and victory will be achieved. If it fails, it must be because one of them didn't do a good enough job. What else could it be?" He had no concept of tank-infantry cooperation, nor did he know that close coordination between infantry and tanks could perfectly integrate these mechanical behemoths with the infantry, creating a unified and powerful fighting force. In the trenches opposite the British, Irwin, hiding behind a machine gun emplacement, observed the British offensive through binoculars. Soon, a satisfied smile appeared on his lips. By this time, Irwin had been promoted to Major General and commander of the 1st Tank Division. This gave him complete command authority over an entire campaign, free from any constraints, and he could even demand the cooperation of 3 infantry divisions. The British, as he had predicted, were completely clueless about how to utilize tanks in combat. This was good news, they would soon learn their lesson, mercilessly crushed under tank tracks, becoming stepping stones for Major General Irwin's promotion. Putting away his binoculars, Major General Irwin expressionlessly raised his hand and waved it forward. His staff and communications officer immediately gave the order, "Fire, fire." The sound of artillery fire rang out immediately, German 105mm howitzers. Shells whistled across the no-man's land, slamming into the artillery positions behind them amidst their fearful yet relieved gazes. During the 3 days of British artillery preparation, the German artillery had not returned fire. The British artillery assumed the German artillery had been crippled, not realizing the Germans had been conserving their strength for this moment. Only then did the British react, but it was too late. The 105mm shells accurately covered the artillery positions scattered in 5 different directions, blasting the British artillery pieces to haphazard angles. The survivors, unable to retaliate, immediately opened fire and moved to new positions, some even abandoned their guns and scattered in all directions. This was Major General Irwin's coordinated infantry artillery operation, temporarily suppressing British artillery to create conditions for the 1st Tank Division to penetrate enemy lines and engage them in close combat. Once the 1st Tank Division was engaged in melee with the British artillery superiority built up across the north bank of the Somme would be rendered useless. Seeing that the time was right, Major General Irwin coldly ordered, "Attack, attack, attack." Staff officers and communications personnel relayed the orders. German tanks, some Upper Silesia and others Lk-2, roared out of the trenches. Major General Irwin had further upgraded tank tactics, believing that on the battlefield, coordination wasn't just between infantry and tanks, but also between tanks themselves. When reporting to his former superior, Lieutenant General Nicholas, he summarized this theory: just as battleships, cruisers, and destroyers coordinate, tanks of different weights on land should also coordinate. Medium tanks have thicker armor and larger caliber guns, but are slower. They are better suited to leading infantry attacks on trenches and firing positions. Light tanks are more mobile and agile. They are better suited to fighting enemy tanks and infantry. Therefore, the German Lk-2 tanks, leading the infantry forward, were tasked with destroying British tanks and scattering British infantry. Following closely behind were the Upper Silesia tanks, tasked with destroying firing positions and crushing British trenches. Chapter 664: The Germans counterattack. When the British saw a large number of German tanks appear before them, they lost their will to fight. They habitually assumed the Germans would defend in trenches as before, using barbed wire and anti-tank ditches to stop their advance, and unleashing a barrage of machine gun fire and artillery shells of various calibers to repel their charge. Although the odds were against them, the British soldiers believed they would eventually break through the trenches. They had tanks providing cover, and in considerable numbers, over 70 at a time, charging towards the enemy in a powerful wave. This was Monty's tactic, which he called the shield formation, named after the ancient Roman shield formation. As the name suggests, the shield formation involved tanks at the front being destroyed by the Germans or forced to withdraw due to malfunctions, creating gaps in the formation, which were then immediately filled by tanks at higher speeds to continue the advance. However, the battle did not unfold as they had imagined. British soldiers cried out in alarm, "To hell with it, the Germans have sent tanks to counterattack, and they have more tanks than us, and some are even bigger. What should we do?" The soldiers turned their gaze to Captain Monty, the brigade commander. Captain Monty hastily glanced at the enemy through his binoculars and ordered, "Don't worry, their tanks are replicas of ours. We can defeat them." With that, he fired 2 shots into the air with his revolver and shouted, "Forward, warriors! Kill them all, kill!" The British soldiers yelled as they charged towards the German tanks. They sprinted ahead of the tanks, charging at breakneck speed, because they were trained to charge relentlessly once a charge began. Some slipped and fell on the uneven snow, crushed by the approaching tanks. They died without understanding why the tanks didn't know they were right in front of them. The tank crews inside were equally bewildered. The gunner had already raised his machine gun and aimed at the enemy, but suddenly all he could see were the backs of his own men. British soldiers who had rushed to the front blocked the gunner's firing angle. Many other British soldiers blocked the driver's observation window. Tank crews inside the tanks shouted frantically, "Get out of the way, you idiots," but no one heard them. Compared to the chaos and even infighting among the British troops, the German advance proceeded methodically. German tanks even consciously found a flat spot to stop and fine-tune their guns to aim at their targets. At the same time, infantrymen in the rear leaned out in waves to fire at the charging British soldiers. Bang! 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 British soldiers fell one by one, collapsing in all sorts of bizarre positions in front of and behind the tanks. Those who were already dead fared relatively well, but those who survived were soon crushed by their own tanks, a scene of carnage and screams filling the air. Boom! Boom! The German tanks opened fire. Less than 100 meters apart, the Lk-2 tank's main armament was a Krupp 37mm short-barreled gun. Although not a dedicated anti-tank gun and lacking strong armor-piercing capabilities, it easily penetrated the Whippet's 12mm armor. One by one, British tanks, belching blue smoke, slowly came to a stop. Those hot in the engine burst into flames with an explosion, instantly filling the air with black smoke and the acrid smell of burning. Note: the Whippet tank was equipped with 4 machine guns but no cannon, so there was no risk of cannon malfunction. The British tanks following behind, employing a shield formation, were quickly reduced to scrap metal. Soon, enemy and friendly tanks were crammed together in front of the lines. The charging British soldiers could only advance through the gaps between the tanks, their once unbroken offensive fragmented into thin streams. And blocking the path was a steel defense line of German guns and tanks. Many British soldiers died without ever pulling the trigger. Because their own men were blocking their way, and their backs were everywhere they looked. Suddenly, those in front fell, and German gun barrels loomed in front of them. Before they could react, they only saw flashes of gunfire before collapsing, powerless, into pools of blood. Monty, commanding the battle, realized the attack had failed and hurriedly shouted, "Retreat! Retreat!" However, the German tanks moved again. With a terrifying clang of steel, they crushed the bodies of British soldiers, passed through the wreckage of whippets, and led their German troops like wolves among sheep into the British infantry. Each German tank was followed by a platoon of dozens of infantrymen. Though few in number, they knew how to coordinate with the tanks. They knew where the tanks' observation windows were, their firing angles, and even how to use their rifle butts to smash the tank armor and guide their advance with sound. British soldiers fell in droves before the lines. The orderly retreat turned into a rout. Everyone was fleeing in panic. Even Captain Monty, the commander, was forced to join the chaos. Captain Monty, protected by his bodyguard, scrambled back to the trench. He gasped for breath, utterly dejected. His offensive, planned for days, had ended in utter failure, with such heavy casualties. Damn it, how was he going to report to General Haig? However, the shouts of his soldiers made him realize the battle wasn't over. "Captain," his bodyguard reported, his voice filled with panic. "The Germans haven't stopped. They're attacking our lines." Monty looked back and, sure enough, saw the German tanks still rumbling towards the lines, only now larger medium tanks were leading the charge. "Organize a defense," Captain Monty shouted hoarsely, his eyes filled with bewilderment and fear. Stop them. However, the British soldiers were all completely bewildered. Some lay prone on the trenches, rifles raised, some stared blankly at Monty, and many more stared in terror at the slowly approaching tanks. How were they going to stop these tanks? With their rifles? Or bayonets? Suddenly, someone started a second retreat. The dark mass of soldiers abandoned their lines like a tidal wave, fleeing for the next, ignoring Monty's shouts. At the British Expeditionary Force headquarters, Haig poured himself a glass of French wine, intending to enjoy a moment of peace before hearing news of victory. 70 tanks, 3 infantry divisions, a total strength of over 60,000 men. Although there would be some casualties, taking this line of defense wouldn't be a problem. As for casualties, that would just mean another conscription order back home. However, he had only drunk half a glass when a guard rushed up to him, breathless, and reported, "General, I think you'd better retreat." "What?" Haig looked at the guard in confusion. "The Germans have counterattacked," the guard replied. "They'll be here soon." Chapter 665. In March, the snow and ice of Paris had melted, replaced by swollen rivers. Perhaps aware of the suffering of civilians during the war, the water level remained below the warning line this year, only reaching the chests of the soldiers in the Jouaf, allowing all Parisians to breathe a sigh of relief, just like the river itself. As dusk fell, the Paris Flying Club landed several planes amidst the roar of engines. Guards were on high alert, having driven away all the reporters who had been waiting nearby an hour earlier, even arresting and interrogating several who were hiding in the shadows and attempting to take photos on suspicion of espionage. Stepping off the plane was Charles. He was aboard a modified Avro, equipped with a more powerful engine and a newly developed enclosed glass cockpit, offering greater speed and improved comfort. This was Dunn's suggestion. He believed that a top-of-the-line Avro was essential for Charles, a commander who needed to frequently travel between major cities. The faster speed would save Charles valuable time. Reaching 150 km per hour would increase safety and reduce the loiter time of the escorting camel fighters. A more comfortable cockpit would allow Charles to rest during the flight, improving his work efficiency. During the flight, Charles truly felt his uniqueness. He was probably the world's first passenger to enjoy a closed cockpit, and top designers had racked their brains to ensure his safety and conserve his energy. Although Charles was a proponent of equality for all, at this stage, the fact remained that he was different from ordinary people, from every angle. Laurent came to pick Charles up. He had by then been promoted to lieutenant colonel. "This is because of your factory expansion in Darvaz, General," Lieutenant Colonel Laurent explained to Charles, expertly maneuvering the steering wheel. "The artillery factory, the laboratory, and recently, a tank production line was added." General Gallieri believed that an infantry battalion was insufficient to guarantee Darvaz's safety, so he expanded it into an infantry regiment, and so, I was promoted to lieutenant colonel. Laurent then joked, I might be the only one promoted because of factory expansion. I'm lucky, aren't I? Charles laughed. You seem to want to experience the battlefield, Laurent shrugged. I do have that thought, as do many in my unit. Why? Charles asked, puzzled. Many of our relatives and friends have died on the battlefield, Laurent said gravely. Or they're wounded and unable to do anything, while we remain unscathed. It gives us a feeling that we owe them something. Charles fell silent. Many civilians did indeed think this way. They wanted to face hardship like others, even at the cost of their lives. Because it would make them feel better, so they wouldn't live with guilt like they do now. However, Charles didn't know if they had considered that many capitalists were enjoying themselves comfortably in the rear, treating the troops and soldiers fighting on the front lines as a game, even as tools for promotion and wealth. So-called fairness was nothing more than a lie used by capitalists to deceive the civilians. The car stopped in front of the city's defense headquarters. Under the streetlights, the guards, already drowsy, saw Charles get out of the car and, as if given a shot of adrenaline, suddenly stood up straight and saluted. Charles didn't make things difficult for them. Simply returning the salute and walking up the steps. The lights were dim in Galini's lounge. He was at his desk, studying the Somme battle situation with documents and maps. Seeing Charles enter, he put his glasses away and casually placed them on the map. Do you know what I want to talk to you about? Galini asked. Charles nodded. Is it because of the British collapse at the Somme? Galini hummed in agreement and handed Charles a document. The British lost hundreds of thousands at the Somme, and after months of effort, they only advanced 10 kilometers. The Germans wiped out all their gains in just 3 days, and there's even a possibility the situation will worsen. Charles sat down opposite Galini. The British want my troops to come to their aid. Galini nodded again. That's in our interest, Charles. We cannot stand by and watch the British expeditionary force collapse before us, otherwise, not only will the British be defeated, but our alliance will also cease to exist. We could be defeated piecemeal by the Germans. Yesterday, Haig had specially traveled to Paris to lobby the French government and had spoken with Galini for over 2 hours. He knew Galini was a man of principle and had considerable influence over Charles. Charles replied calmly, I completely agree with your thinking, General. What I object to is having Haig command me and my troops. As you may know, even the British Prime Minister doesn't trust Haig to lead the army. Charles was speaking the truth. After suffering 100,000 casualties in a single day at the Somme with little to show for it, British Prime Minister Lloyd George had lost faith in Haig's supposed military talent, especially since Haig's results contrasted sharply with Charles's record. The image above shows British Prime Minister Lloyd George during World War I. However, Haig belonged to the old British aristocracy, and his wife was Queen Alexandra's close friend, first bridesmaid. Because of this relationship, King George had unwavering faith in Haig's military abilities. Coupled with Kitchener's reliance on him, Haig's command in the British Expeditionary Force remained unchallenged. That's the result of bureaucracy, Charles said with disdain. It's the choice of the old British aristocracy, not the choice of war, nor the choice of the soldiers on the front lines. The British Expeditionary Force is paying the price for it. If I compromise, it means my troops will also be wasted on the battlefield by this butcher. Galini waited quietly for Charles to finish speaking before replying, if that's all it's about, I think you can rest assured. I've already discussed it with Haig. He's only the nominal commander, and he'll give you relatively free command and decision-making authority. Then, Charles replied, my decision is no reinforcements. Galini frowned. I know you're unhappy with Britain's interference in our country and even its attempts to control it, and so am I, but Charles, this concerns the life and death of France. I'm serious, General, Charles replied. The British command on the Somme is extremely chaotic. Their army includes the Afrika Corps, the New Zealand Army Corps, the Australian Army Corps, and the Indian Army. If we add the French army to that, what do you think will happen? We can't even tell which army is our own. Chapter 666 Ardennes Forest. I know, Galini replied, but as I said, we cannot stand by and watch the British Expeditionary Force collapse. We must reinforce them. Charles didn't speak, but pointed to Charleroi in Belgium on the map. The map above shows the location of Charleroi, Belgium. The blue area represents the Ardennes forests, a rugged and complex terrain unsuitable for mobile warfare, essentially dividing the battlefield into two disconnected parts. It was widely believed at the time that armored forces could not cross it. During World War II, the German army bypassed a Maginot Line and entered France through this forest. Gallery looked puzzled. You plan to attack Charleroi? Yes, Charles replied. This is a thorn in the side before attacking the Liège fortress. Backed by mountains and forests, it is both offensive and defensive, and can reinforce Liège. Gallery nodded in agreement. Prior to this, Charles's fighting in Belgium had been primarily in the north, rarely venturing into the complex terrain of the south. To completely liberate Belgium, moving south was the inevitable choice. But, Gallieni asked doubtfully, what does this have to do with reinforcing the Somme aircraft, General? Charles replied, once we capture Charleroi, our bombers can use it as a base to bomb the German supply lines. Gallieni pondered for a moment, then shook his head slightly. That certainly helps, Lieutenant General, but we all know that bombers lack accuracy, and their destructive power against enemy facilities is not ideal. Secondly, the Germans have learned how to avoid our bombing raids. They have even strengthened their air defenses. This is a fact that the battle has progressed to this point. The Caproni is not a dive bomber. Bombing large targets like German airfields or warehouses is manageable, but bombing smaller targets like railways and bridges is largely a matter of luck. At the same time, the Germans have learned to release smoke to obscure visibility and have used Becker machine guns for anti-aircraft defense, forcing the Caproni to avoid low-altitude bombing, further reducing the bombing effectiveness. Charles was forced to reveal his true thoughts. I intend to cross the Ardennes, General. Gallery, not yet understanding Charles's meaning, dismissively replied, that's not a good idea, Charles. Even if your army can cross the Ardennes, without heavy weapons and insufficient ammunition, you won't pose a threat to the Germans. Instead, you might be encircled and annihilated. Military operations aren't simply about troops infiltrating the mountains. If logistics can continuously supply ammunition and provisions across the mountainous forests, these infiltrating units will quickly find themselves in dire straits due to lack of ammunition. But Charles answered casually, I'm talking about armored forces, the 1st Panzer Corps. Gallery stared at Charles in astonishment, then said after a long pause, that's impossible. There are no roads there, even cars can't get through, yet you expect tanks to pass. But Charles knew it was possible. The Germans had taken a much longer route through these mountains during World War II. The key was thorough pre-war intelligence gathering, sending men to carefully scout every passable mountain path, identifying areas where bridges and roads could be quickly built, and where widening or reinforcement was needed. The Char A1 weighs only 7 tons. A little over a ton heavier than the German Panzer I tank from World War II. As long as scouts and engineers are sent to survey the area, it shouldn't be a problem. Note, the Panzer I tank weighs 5.4 tons. Gallery still couldn't believe it. He looked at the map and then at Charles. Are you sure you want to do this? This is more difficult than you imagine. How will you guarantee supplies? Armored units mean more fuel, and also spare parts, sidecars, General, Charles said firmly. If we can build a road through the forest that the Char A1 can pass through, then the sidecars can certainly pass through, but that's not enough, Gallery replied. Far from enough. Indeed, it wasn't enough. Once war broke out, massive amounts of ammunition would be needed. French and German bullets were not interchangeable, and even captured German ammunition would be unusable. But Charles had already considered this problem. Therefore, I'm training the armored corps to use German rifles, including the machine guns used on tanks. This equipment wasn't difficult to obtain. The Belgian army was equipped with German-made weapons, which FN could produce. Then Charles added, also, I'm trying to use the Caproni to airdrop supplies. Airdrop supplies? Gallieni was stunned by Charles's words. Airplanes could do that? Why not? Charles replied. Airdropping weapons and ammunition might be difficult. They're likely to break upon impact. But airdropping food is no problem. Bread and flour won't break, just need proper packaging and waterproofing. This was to account for the possibility of them getting damp or breaking and spilling when airdropped into water. However, these weren't technically difficult. Gallieni nodded slightly, looking at Charles with a hint of doubt. It seems you've been thinking about this for a while. Yes, Charles readily admitted. Ever since capturing Hasselt and facing the Liège fortress, Charles had considered going through the Ardennes forest to bypass it. However, at that time, the goal was to bypass the Liège fortress without attacking the German Somme defenses from the rear. There was one more thing Charles hadn't told Gallieni. With Charles's current strength, once his troops crossed the Ardennes forest, occupied an area, and established or captured an airfield, the Caproni could immediately transport supplies, and fighter jets could be deployed to the airfield and join the battle. Charles felt there was no need to say more. At this time, Gallieni still struggled to understand this operational model, nor did he know its benefits. Gallieni was already quite impressed: armored units traversing mountains and forests, sidecars providing supplies, and bombers airdropping supplies. He felt that Charles's forces had evolved to another level, far beyond the level of this world. However, there are still risks, Charles, Gallieni reminded him. I don't know if you've considered what the consequences would be if your troops failed to successfully cross the mountains, or if they did but couldn't achieve victory. I know, General, Charles replied. The British casualties would be heavy. This was a risk Charles was happy to see. However, Charles didn't say that. He added, but high risk also means high reward. Once we succeed, Gallieni turned his gaze to the map, looked at it for a while, and finally nodded in agreement with the plan. As Charles had said, the risk was heavy British casualties. But success would be a decisive victory in the Somme campaign, pushing the defensive line forward by dozens of kilometers. More importantly, it could potentially encircle the entire German force on the Somme. Another massive encirclement, Gallieni sighed inwardly. The Germans might be in deep trouble. Chapter 667 The Most Anxious Person. Gallieni discussed the details with Charles for a while, then suddenly thought of something. He looked up and asked Charles, if that's the case, how should I refuse Haig? Should I tell him the entire battle plan? Gallieni believed this would not only dispel Haig's suspicions about France and Charles, but also allow the British army to prepare in advance to cooperate with the French counter-offensive. But Charles shook his head. That's not a good idea, General. We can consider doing so, Charles, Gallieni insisted. After all, it concerns the life and death of the British army. Haig wouldn't be foolish enough to reveal intelligence to the Germans. It wouldn't benefit him. Is that so? Charles countered, his tone calm. Is there a problem? Gallieni looked at Charles with suspicion. French law forbids soldiers from engaging in business or politics, a rule Gallieni firmly adhered to. Therefore, he was almost completely ignorant of these two fields, unaware of how terrifying and unscrupulous the realm of politics and business truly was. That's right, Charles drew a line in the Ardennes with his finger. The difficulty for armored forces crossing the Ardennes isn't just about roads and supplies. If the enemy learns of our plans beforehand, even if the Germans only get a tip-off, it could lead to the annihilation of our entire force. Gallieni nodded in agreement. If the Germans knew in advance that Charles's troops would be advancing through the Ardennes, they could simply lay an ambush in the forest with a small infantry unit. In the jungle warfare of the mountains, armored forces, heavily reliant on roads and terrain, would be rendered useless. Charles's elite armored units would be surrounded and trapped by German infantry. I'm not used to putting my fate in other people's hands, General, Charles said, especially those who compete with me in the military, political, and business fields. Gallieni was taken aback. Competition in politics and business. He could understand competition in the military. Charles's victory contrasted sharply with Haig's achievements, making Haig and even the British army a laughingstock and shaking the colonial army's confidence in Britain's global dominance. But in politics and business, Haig, a British soldier, what competition could he possibly have with Charles, a French lieutenant general? Charles calmly replied, my military victories will affect Haig's political career, General. As for the business world, because I control resources and have built insurance and shipping companies in Britain, I've offended almost every British businessman. They now hate me to the core, and I believe that the King of England, Kitchener, and Haig all hope for my downfall. Gallieni suddenly understood. This was a case of the tallest tree attracting the most wind. Charles's rapid rise had infringed upon the interests of many, including the British. If the intelligence were leaked to Haig, Haig might actually use this opportunity to eliminate Charles. Or at least, to pull Charles off his throne of invincible war god, thus shattering the colonial army's awe and illusions about Charles's command abilities. As for the lives of the British troops, that was a matter of the nation and its people. Many of them were colonial soldiers. What was more important than their personal interests? Thinking this, Gallieni nodded heavily. You're right, I'll handle this. Then, his gaze turned to the map on the table. And after a moment's hesitation, he analyzed seriously. We have reason to believe that the 1st Panzer Corps and the 6th Army are the backbone of Belgium. Once we transfer them out of Belgium, the Germans will launch a counter-offensive from the Liège fortress. This will leave the Allies unable to defend both ends, which is clearly not a wise choice, Charles said. Haig probably won't believe these words. It's all right, Gallieni interrupted Charles. Emperor Albert I also has the right to know about this matter, and I believe you will agree with my thoughts." Charles was speechless for a moment. He realized he was wrong. Gallieni was a shrewd politician. Emperor Albert I was the one who least wanted Charles's troops transferred out of Belgium, and once he knew about this, Gallieni might not need to do anything. Hasselt, the capital of Limburg province. Under the starlit night sky, Emperor Albert I held a dinner at the city hall with a dozen dignitaries. The banquet was kept simple, with a buffet table set with common pastries and fruits, and candlelight replacing the traditional lighting. The violinist was a local, hired temporarily, and even during his performance, several discordant notes could be clearly heard. But none of this dampened Albert I's spirits. He tapped his glass to attract everyone's attention, climbed 2 steps to his high position, and declared in a loud, passionate voice, "Ladies and gentlemen, I am pleased to reiterate that we are standing on Hasselt. We are now on the border between Belgium and the Netherlands. What I need to worry about now is how to sustain the supply of over 500,000 German prisoners of war." The dignitaries responded with a relaxed laugh. King Albert I continued, "We are only 1 step away from recapturing the entire territory of Belgium. The Liège fortress is only a dozen kilometers away. It is the gateway for the German invasion of Belgium. Once we capture it, we will imprison all the invaders within our borders, leaving them nowhere to escape. Moreover, I firmly believe that under Charles' leadership, our valiant Belgian people will surely accomplish this great mission. Long live Belgium! Glory to all of us!" The dignitaries echoed King Albert I's call, shouting and cheering. At that moment, in a corner near the aisle, a communications soldier quietly pushed open a door. He nervously glanced around the crowd, saw Major General Eden, quickly stepped forward, whispered a few words, and handed him a telegram. Major General Eden's expression changed. He took the telegram, nodded, and ordered the communications soldier to remain silent, then casually walked towards King Albert I. At this point, Charles was enough to determine the fate of Belgium. His transfer could instantly demoralize the Belgian military and civilians, and all of Belgium's previous gains could be wiped out. Major General Eden believed that excessive caution was warranted in this matter. Approaching, he whispered a few words to Albert I, who had been excited, instantly turned pale, coldly staring at Major General Eden and asking in a low voice, "Is this true?" "Yes, Your Majesty." Major General Eden secretly slipped a telegram into Albert I's hand, a telegram from General Gallieni. Albert I didn't read it carefully, he simply folded the telegram, stuffed it into his pocket, and, feigning a friendly smile, nodded repeatedly to both sides, apologizing before hurriedly leaving with Major General Eden. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 668 Harvesting Popularity. At the Hasselt headquarters, Albert I eagerly pulled a telegram from his pocket as soon as he entered his office. It was indeed from Gallieni. "Given the recent defeat of the British Army at the Somme, we believe only Charles's forces can reverse this decline. Given that the initial German deployment at the Somme includes a tank division and 3 infantry divisions, we need to transfer Charles's 1st Panzer Corps and the main force of the 6th Army to the Somme to meet the enemy, to prevent the Germans from taking advantage of the situation in Belgium. Your Majesty must make defensive preparations in advance." Albert I hesitated for a moment, then ordered Major General Eden, "Reply, I want to know if this is General Haig's order, the decision of the French Parliament, or Lieutenant General Charles's intention." Soon after, Major General Eden returned with a telegram, his voice filled with surprise. "General Gallieni said they haven't made a final decision yet. This is General Haig's personal request." Albert I breathed a sigh of relief. If this was the case, there was still room for maneuver. Without hesitation, he immediately telegraphed Gallieni, "I don't think this is a wise choice, General. Please reconsider. And I think the most important thing now is Lieutenant General Charles's opinion. He will certainly give an answer that satisfies everyone. If Charles thinks it's okay, then it's okay. Even if problems arise, Charles will take responsibility, and one day when he returns, he will still be able to reclaim the lost territory." Then Albert I ordered, "Prepare the car, I'm going to Paris," but he immediately changed his mind. No, prepare the plane. He wanted to get to Paris as soon as possible, even if flying at night was unsafe. Just now, Albert I had decided that he would approach the matter from several angles simultaneously. First, to lobby in Paris to convince French officials that Hague's reinforcement plan was futile. Second, to mobilize the entire Belgian military and civilian population to protest against Hague's disregard for Belgium's safety. Most importantly, he needed to find out Charles's thoughts. As long as Charles, the Mars of France, thought the plan was unfeasible, Hague would lose most of his support. After Charles finished speaking with Valéry, it was already past 10 o'clock. He went downstairs to the officers' club. Strangely, Paris, once known as the City of Light, was now shrouded in darkness. Where candles used to illuminate the streets, only a few intersections in the center offered any light. Entering the club only deepened his confusion. Normally, it wouldn't close until after midnight, and 10 o'clock was usually bustling with activity, but now it was completely empty. Lucia and Gerald were cleaning, preparing for closing. Seeing Charles enter, the two, looking exhausted, paused for a moment, then broke into charming smiles. Whether from professional demeanor or intimidation of Charles's rank, it was unclear. Gerald nudged Lucia and turned to Charles, saying, "Wait a moment, General. What would you like?" "A glass of soda," Charles said. He didn't want coffee to keep him awake. Lucia simply stated, "Regular soda water." The club's soda water came in two types, regular and hard soda, the latter containing 5% alcohol, roughly equivalent to beer. "Okay," Gerald responded, quickly bringing it to the two seated at the table. Upon returning to the counter, he turned on a few more colored lights to enhance the ambience. Charles glanced out the dark window and asked, "Paris seems different than before." "It's related to you," Lucia said, taking a few sips of her soda water. She seemed a little thirsty. "Related to me?" Charles looked at Lucia, bewildered. Lucia nodded and put down her glass. "The capitalists are trying to create an atmosphere unfavorable to you. You might not know, but because you've been commanding naval operations in Antwerp, no one has told you about these conspiracies hidden in the shadows." Charles looked bewildered. "An atmosphere unfavorable to me?" "Yes." Lucia unconsciously rubbed her right arm, which always ached from mixing drinks for so long. "Recently, there's been talk that Charles has used echo detectors to control and monopolize the transportation of supplies, causing prices to skyrocket. Now, people can't afford electricity or even candles. Cinemas are only open 3 days a week, and the streets are deserted after 10 p.m. because people don't have extra money to spend, including our club." Charles still didn't understand. "But I haven't done anything. I just established insurance companies and shipping companies, and the supplies I transport have always been sold at cost. Supplies should be more readily available than before, since Charles ensured more supplies were safely delivered to France, free from British control and exploitation." "I know," Lucia laughed. "This has nothing to do with you." This only confused Charles more. First she said because of you, and now she says it has nothing to do with you. Aren't these two statements contradictory? Lucia seemed to see through Charles's thoughts. She smiled and leaned closer, explaining, "Like I said, this is something the capitalists did intentionally. They bought up all the supplies you were selling at a fair price and hoarded them in warehouses, artificially creating the illusion of a greater shortage." Charles understood. This was a tactic used by domestic capitalists to frame Charles, and perhaps even members of parliament were involved. They were operating at the crucial juncture of Charles's control over the shipping lanes, allowing them to hoard goods and sell them at high prices for huge profits, while also damaging Charles's reputation, a win-win situation. "When did this happen?" Charles asked. "I mean, prices have risen to this level for quite some time now, haven't they?" "Shortly after your echo detector achieved its first victory on the battlefield," Lucia nodded slightly. Charles frowned. "That was 2 months ago. You should have told me sooner." "I think now is the perfect time." Lucia raised an eyebrow. "What?" Charles didn't understand what Lucia meant. Lucia chuckled softly. "Only then, after you speak up to clarify, will people suddenly realize they've misunderstood you. They'll see the ugly face of capitalists, and realize they've been deceived. Then, they'll think of an even more serious problem. While you're fighting the enemy on the front lines and ensuring the supply and transport of France, the capitalists in the rear are inflating prices and using that to slander you." As she spoke, Lucia picked up her glass and lightly clinked it against Charles's. They made a crisp sound. "You're welcome. It's what I should do." At that moment, Charles realized that Lucia's abilities extended beyond intelligence gathering. Things were indeed as she suspected. If they had nipped the capitalists' little scheme in the bud at the first sign of trouble, the current reversal wouldn't have been so shocking. Undoubtedly, this would garner Charles another wave of popularity, Chapter 669 Wartime Rationing System. In Lavas, in Joka's little house. Perhaps accustomed to a simple life, or perhaps enjoying the harmonious relationship with his neighbors, Joka had never moved to a larger house, despite his current wealth. He had simply updated the furniture, disposed of things he couldn't bear to throw away, and transformed the first-floor storage room into a cozy little study. It was past 11 at night, and Joka was still in his study checking accounts. Business had expanded rapidly recently, with new insurance and shipping operations, a military factory in the United States, and an expanded factory in town keeping Joka, the nominal owner of the Bernard Group, extremely busy. Camille brought in a cup of coffee and gently placed it on Joka's desk. Usually, she would quietly leave at this time to avoid interrupting his work, but this time, she stood by the desk for a while. What? Joka sensed something was amiss, stopped what he was doing, and looked up at Camille. Do you have time to talk? Camille asked cautiously. Of course, Joka nodded. I know Charles wouldn't do that, but, Camille hesitated. Joka instantly understood what Camille was referring to, and said helplessly, of course he wouldn't do such a thing, Camille. I know, Camille replied, but you don't know how scarce supplies are right now, Joka. Uncle Anadok told me yesterday that many people can't afford flour anymore, they can only make bread from sawdust and potato peels. Milk and other meats are almost non-existent, people are eating dogs and cats. Note, during World War I, some people kept cats and fed them because cats could catch mice and hardly needed to be fed, they were called roof rabbits. This has nothing to do with Charles, nothing to do with the Bernard Group, Joka replied. We always sell the supplies at cost, it's just that we can't control who buys them. Joka also hoped to sell these supplies to those who truly needed them. He even refused to let capitalists buy them at high prices. However, the capitalists hired a group of poor people to scramble for the supplies, regardless of where Joka placed them. Can't we think of a way? Camille's eyes were filled with anxiety. Although I know all this, it happened after the Charles took control of shipping, and people still believe it's related to the Charles. Joka nodded slowly, his face grave. People wouldn't listen to Joka's explanation, they only knew that the Charles had controlled shipping, and life had gotten worse day by day, until now they were starving and unable to survive. Worse still, winter had just ended, their food supplies were gone, and they had no seeds to plant. Just as Joka was at his wit's end, the sound of a car engine came from outside, growing louder as it approached, finally screeching to halt. It's the Charles, Camille exclaimed, both surprised and delighted, turning and running out to greet him. Joka didn't rush out, he walked slowly into the living room, his mind racing, trying to figure out how to resolve the situation. Soon, Charles appeared at the door. Seeing Joka's expression, he guessed the gist of the matter. Are you worried about supplies, father? Joka was taken aback, his gaze towards Charles filled with surprise. You already know. Yes, Charles nodded, glancing around the living room. We bought a new sofa. Yes, Joka sat down with Charles. Not wanting to waste too much time on the sofa issue, he asked directly. How do you plan to solve this problem? I mean, the supplies. Camille, who had originally intended to go to the kitchen to prepare food, sat quietly at the table, waiting for Charles's answer. Charles removed his general's cap and placed it aside, his tone relaxed. I just need to clarify things. I know, Joka nodded, people will believe you. You can also provide evidence to let people know what the capitalists have done. This was a piece of cake for Charles. He enjoyed high prestige among the people and controlled 2 media outlets, one of which was an authoritative military newspaper. No one could silence him. But this still doesn't solve the problem, Joka said with dissatisfaction. I mean, the capitalists will continue to do this to oppose your control over resources. You could call it coercion. Charles understood what Joka meant. What the capitalists really wanted was the echo detector, just like they told people that this was happening because Charles had a monopoly on the echo detector. If Charles sold the echo detector to others, such as the Toulon shipyard and Britain, the military could quickly produce a large number of echo detectors and equip them on warships. Then the supply situation would improve, and people would have plenty of food. Unfortunately, the capitalists were wrong. Charles wouldn't give in. This not only wouldn't create any obstacles for Charles, but it also presented him with an excellent opportunity. It's simple, father, Charles replied. We can implement a wartime rationing system. A wartime rationing system? Joka's eyes lit up. Camille looked blank, she had no concept of rationing. Yes, Charles replied, Once approved, France will, in the name of the nation, purchase all the supplies that land at a unified price and then distribute them uniformly. Before this, although Charles held the reins of shipping routes and the fate of supplies, he still had no real control over them. Capitalists only needed to purchase Charles's insurance to ship the supplies France needed from the United States, using this to control the economy and bribe members of parliament and political figures. Once the wartime rationing system was implemented, these underhanded manipulations by capitalists would be completely severed. But Joka still had doubts. What if capitalists collude with members of parliament to embezzle supplies by falsifying accounts? Charles smiled. You forgot, all supplies land under the protection of the French Navy. We can use the pretext of protecting their safety to inventory the supplies. Joka instantly understood. The French Navy could inventory every single supply transported. In other words, they had a ledger. If any capitalist embezzled supplies without including them in the national treasury for unified rationing, the French Navy only needed to check the ledger to expose them immediately. Great idea, Joka exclaimed, beaming. Then this rationing system, I've already reported to General Gallieni, Charles said. What's needed now is simply the voice of the people. As long as the voice of the people is loud enough, the councillors won't dare to defy public opinion and forcibly refuse to pass this project. Chapter 670 To Be or Not to Be. Everything proceeded according to Charles's plan. The next day, the Heroic Lectures newspaper, abandoning its usual low-key approach, devoted an entire page to condemning capitalists for hoarding and price gouging. It meticulously compared the supplies France received after its victory with the echo detector, demonstrating that after Charles's remarkable triumph, the supplies arriving in France increased by half instantly, and had now almost doubled. But where did all these supplies go? Why hadn't they reached those who needed them? Photographs provided concrete evidence of major capitalists stockpiling supplies. There were also images of the Bernard Group selling supplies at bargain prices only to be met with malicious hoarding. Of course, these photos were provided by Lucia. She had been meticulously prepared for this moment. Finally, in his article, Cobno vehemently denounced, while our soldiers are bravely fighting the enemy on the front lines, what are the capitalists doing in the rear? They are trying to starve the soldiers' families, doing everything they can to drain them of resources. Even worse, they intend to pin all the blame on Charles, making people believe that it was all Charles's fault. It's all lie woven by the capitalists. They want to destroy not only Charles, but also the faith of France, the soldiers' spirit of resistance against aggression, and the entire country. The Le Petit Journal followed up precisely. It satirized this phenomenon with a cartoon, several well-dressed gentlemen, while sucking blood with rubber tubes, obscenely direct civilians armed with kitchen knives and hunting rifles to attack the backs of soldiers fighting the Germans in the trenches. The question followed, is this what you want? The article sharply pointed out, wake up, French people blinded by lies. Capitalists want you to hate each other, even attack the heroes of France. Only in this way can they firmly grasp the power and wealth in their hands. Finally, the little daily even thoughtfully included the addresses of the warehouses the capitalists used to hoard supplies. People's anger was instantly ignited. Young and strong workers and wounded soldiers immediately organized to attack the capitalists' warehouses, and eventually even the elderly and women joined in. When people opened the warehouses, they were stunned by the mountains of supplies piled up inside. Unbelievable, this is all true. They hid supplies in the warehouses and told us it was Charles's fault. They would rather let us go hungry or even starve to death, but pile up supplies here to mold, just to make us hate Charles. These bastards, we can't let them get away with this easily. They are traitors to France, spies for the Germans, or they've been bought off by the Germans. This logic seemed sound. As French citizens, we had no reason to target the heroes leading France to victory. The only plausible explanation for their actions was that they had been bribed by the Germans. Once this accusation was leveled, it was no longer just a simple protest. Angry crowds beat the warehouse manager and his henchmen, who were hastily moving supplies, half to death. They stormed into the capitalists' villas, dragged them out, and then, amidst spittle and curses, hanged them from plane trees by the roadside. Suddenly, Parisian capitalists were in a state of panic. Some died, some fled. And those who couldn't escape rushed to the city hall with their families, seeking refuge with the army. The people remained unconvinced, surrounding the city hall and demanding that Brian hand over the traitors. Those are a group of criminals who betrayed France. They should be punished. Whoever protects them means colluding with them. Yes, anyone willing to protect traitors must have been bred by them. Finally, Galini stepped forward to appease the crowd. You are right, their crimes are unforgivable, but I don't think hanging them is the best option, because there may be larger interest groups behind them. Believe me, I will use them to track down more traitors and bring them to justice. Only then did the people's anger gradually subside and they dispersed, satisfied. That afternoon, Galini urgently convened Parliament. Just when the members of Parliament thought Galini was responding to the people's riot, Galini surprisingly proposed a wartime rationing system. He stood on the podium, waving the documents in his hand, and said to the members of Parliament with a helpless expression, "Gentlemen, you all know what has happened without me saying it. The riots are not just happening in Paris, but also in Dunkirk, Nantes, Toulon, and more than a dozen other cities. This is a nationwide unrest. I must warn you, gentlemen, France is on the verge of collapse." At this point, Galini paused intentionally, his sharp gaze sweeping across the room, his eyes filled with mockery and threat. Under the members of Parliament's apprehensive gaze, Galini continued, "The situation on the front lines is not optimistic. We recently experienced a mutiny, which was only stabilized thanks to Charles's efforts. The fighting at Verdun continues, and it still needs a large amount of supplies to have any hope of victory. The north bank of the Somme has collapsed, and General Foch's position on the south bank is in dire straits. At this time, if a nationwide unrest breaks out in the rear and cannot be quickly quelled, it will be fatal to France." The room fell silent. The members of Parliament knew that Galini was not bluffing, but presenting a stark reality. If France were to completely collapse, no one would benefit, except for those members of Parliament who had been bought off by Britain and Germany. After a long pause, Armand's casual voice finally broke the silence. "So, Your Excellency Minister, what do you think we should do to quickly quell this unrest?" Galini nodded slightly to Lieutenant Colonel Fernand, who was waiting below the stage. Fernand immediately led his men to distribute the documents. Galini explained, "This is a wartime rationing system. We intend to centrally purchase and distribute the landed supplies." This decision was immediately met with opposition from the members of Parliament, many of whom had interests tied to capitalists, some holding substantial shares. "You can't do this. This is market freedom. Doing this will severely damage the French economy. This is excessive government intervention in the market. It's dictatorial." Galini coldly interrupted the members of Parliament. "Gentlemen, the decision of life or death rests with you." The room fell silent again. If they disagreed, they wouldn't even get past this hurdle. People wouldn't tolerate capitalists continuing to control supplies in this way. Galera glanced at the silent members of Parliament and nodded with satisfaction. "Now, let's begin the vote on this issue." Chapter 671. You're on the way to victory. The wartime rationing system was successfully passed by Parliament. This was overseen by the Reserve Army Group led by Galini. Under the rationing system, Galini restricted unnecessary entertainment and luxury consumption. For example, cinemas were limited to 3 days a week, Parisian museums were closed, and the entire population was given a fixed amount of natural gas, electricity, and coal. At the same time, the prices of tobacco and alcohol were significantly increased, except for those supplied to the troops. This was aimed at the capitalists and wealthy classes enjoying themselves in the rear. In addition, bread and food were distributed free of charge to civilians on a per capita basis, and food supplies were sold at fixed rations at fair prices. This was to ensure the survival of civilians, while rationing prevented capitalists from forcing the poor to purchase supplies. If the poor did so, it meant they would have to contribute their rations and go hungry. Of all the facilities, only the Invalides, the military compound, was open without restriction. Because the Invalides could display war trophies, including an A-7V tank captured from the Germans, Galini believed this would promote patriotism and boost the morale of the military and civilians. The image above shows Les Invalides, also known as the Paris Invalides, a building commissioned by Louis XIV in 1670 to house wounded soldiers. During World War I, it was used to display war trophies, and during the 2024 Olympics, it served as a venue for archery, athletics, and other competitions. Charles didn't appear or intervene in any of these matters. He did this to avoid suspicion and accusations that he was using these methods to further control resources. Although everyone knew that Charles actually controlled the resources, even capitalists, politics sometimes requires this unbreakable barrier. The French people knew this, but instead of opposing it, they expressed their support. "We can only trust Charles. The supplies should be controlled and distributed by him." If we don't trust him, who should we trust? The capitalists who hoard supplies? Or the politicians who do nothing but collude with the capitalists? I believe Charles won't let us go hungry. Everything will be alright. Charles indeed did not disappoint. He immediately distributed the captured supplies to the civilians, even promising to sell seeds to them at low interest rates to prepare for planting soon. This was not difficult for Charles. He only needed to purchase seeds from America, load them onto ships, and 7 days later they would arrive in Dunkirk and be delivered to the people continuously. France was instantly abuzz. People, feeling reborn, spread the word of Charles's good deeds. Only Charles would do this, offering low-interest loans. If we don't have a harvest and can't pay, Charles will be the one who loses. Other capitalists wouldn't do such a losing business. Yes, other capitalists would take advantage of this to raise seed prices and exploit us during this tense situation. Charles saved us, not just on the battlefield, but he also kept us from starving. In the town of Darvaz, neighbors who had received food surrounded Joka's cottage, coming in droves to express their gratitude. We wronged Charles, Mrs. Bernard. Charles is a good man. We should trust him. He wouldn't do anything to harm us. Thank you. Your family are all good people, very good people. May God bless you. Camille shook hands with her neighbors while tears streamed down her face. She didn't know why, but the tears just wouldn't stop flowing. Joka appeared quite calm. He politely thanked each of his neighbors and instructed them to prepare for planting. Only by growing more food can we truly alleviate the food crisis, Joka told his neighbors. Because we have millions of troops fighting on the front lines, they need our supplies. The neighbors nodded, their eyes glistening with tears. Charles remained in his room, not coming downstairs. He disliked and couldn't handle such socializing. Neighbors would come in twos and threes, and occasionally people from other villages and even Paris would come, just to shake Charles's hand or say a word of thanks. If he had to receive everyone, Charles might be stuck there for days. He sat alone at his desk, quietly flipping through the reports Joka had sent, detailing the recent business progress of the Bernard Group. The insurance and shipping businesses in Britain and France were thriving, even expanding into the United States, as American shipping companies also needed to join Charles's escort fleet. Regarding the laboratory, Stokes, citing business reasons, moved his entire family to the town of Dawes, bringing with him a group of key personnel from Scott Machinery Company. Charles frowned. Bringing talent was certainly good, but they were British, and as the saying goes, those who are not of our race are bound to have different intentions, and there was a century-old feud between Britain and France, with them disliking each other. These key personnel have been screened. Joka had somehow appeared beside Charles, noticing Charles's troubled expression as he looked at the list in his hand, and guessed what Charles was worried about. Charles turned to look at Joka and hummed in agreement. I believe Mr. Stokes will conduct the screening. Stokes was, after all, a traitor, and he didn't want a few more spies around him to be detrimental. The situation in Britain isn't good either, Joka explained, especially after the British Expeditionary Force's defeat at the Somme. I heard that Britain has launched another emergency conscription, requiring 300,000 new soldiers at once. This was Higgs' military talent. His thinking was simple. If victory couldn't be achieved on the battlefield, it meant there weren't enough troops. If there weren't enough troops, conscription was necessary. Whether or not these lives could be effectively utilized was not a concern for this butcher. Joka gestured with his chin towards the list. If they hadn't come with Stokes, they might have been drafted for being laid off. Charles instantly understood. Those who came with Stokes were, in a sense, deserters, their employment contracts with the Bernard Group exempting them from the battlefield. In other words, the company held their lives in its hands, so loyalty was hardly a concern. A hint of helplessness appeared on Charles's lips. It seemed ironic that the battlefield had given Charles the opportunity to recruit talent. Then, Joka sighed softly, saying abruptly, I'm proud of you, Charles, and so is your mother. What? Charles stared at Joka in surprise. He usually didn't say such things. Joka stepped forward and put his hand on Charles's shoulder, his gaze sweeping across the window to the neighbors lingering below, lost in thought. They think you saved them. And so do I. That's more important than winning a battle, he said. The soldiers will fight for you because you've protected their families, giving them peace of mind. You've done well, Charles. You're on the road to victory. Chapter 672 The Power of Life and Death. As Joka said, the successful implementation of wartime rationing was more important than winning a battle. For Charles, the invincible war god. A victory was merely adding to his record. The military and civilians were already used to it, and nothing had changed. But the series of operations under wartime rationing dealt a heavy blow to domestic capitalists, causing them to completely lose control of supplies. When necessary, Charles could even use public office for private gain. The supplies that landed were tallied by the Navy under Charles's control. With just a word from Charles, one or even several merchant ships could be selectively ignored by the Navy. After landing, these supplies would not be included in the national treasury. They could become invisible resources that Charles could dispose of at will. Military supplies, wounded soldiers, military families. Charles could readily produce large quantities of supplies to win over the hearts and minds of the people, and bribing members of parliament was also a piece of cake. More importantly, Charles used this to test the French people's tolerance for dictatorship. This wartime rationing system, to put it bluntly, meant that Charles held the power of life and death in one hand. Wartime supplies were everything. They could determine the life and death of everyone, including the frontline troops. The fact that resources were controlled by Charles, rather than decided by Parliament, was, to some extent, a realization of Charles's dictatorship. The French people were averse to dictatorship, even habitually opposing it. Parliament also took precautions against it, repeatedly risking defeat to weaken Charles. But now, Charles had successfully created an atmosphere where power not being handed over to him would be dangerous. The people would starve, the military and civilians would riot, and the nation would perish. Ultimately, to save the country, Charles had to shoulder the burden in this crisis, becoming the sole controller of resources. The whole process was smooth and natural. Many didn't even perceive the dictatorship. The mentality of the French military and civilians unconsciously shifted from opposing all forms of dictatorship to firmly supporting Charles's dictatorship. They just didn't realize it. Djoka understood Charles. He knew long ago that Charles's ultimate goal was to defeat the domestic capitalists and ascend to the pinnacle of power. Now, Charles could be considered to have achieved a considerable scale. Incredibly, Djoka marveled, it had only taken less than 2 years. Djoka had always thought it impossible, and now, suddenly realizing he was so close to success, he could hardly believe it was real. Charles didn't delve into the topic. He knew that under the French system, achieving something without revealing it was the best option, because it would make people think it was their choice, not Charles's. Like the wartime rationing system, power was handed to Charles under public pressure and support, not because Charles wanted it. Charles flipped through another document and casually asked, "How's the business in America going?" "Very well," Djoka nodded, his eyes gradually shifting from satisfaction to suspicion. "You seem to have known what was going to happen all along." Charles feigned ignorance. "What happened?" Djoka flipped back 2 pages of the documents on the table and said. "You released the Garand rifles into the civilian market at half price. They were immediately snapped up, and eventually appeared on the black market, where the price doubled or even tripled." Charles calmly echoed, "Really?" "Yes," Djoka nodded. "You have no idea how popular this rifle is, and you certainly can't imagine who the main buyers are." Charles shrugged, indicating he knew nothing. "It's the mob, the American mob." Djoka's face held an incredulous smile. "I thought Americans would use this rifle for hunting, but I never imagined they'd equip their gangs with it." Djoka then flipped down 2 more pages of the document. "Look at this. In 1 month, there were 8 gang shootouts in New York, the largest recorded shootouts. 2 gangs were wiped out in these shootouts. The U.S. deployed police to try and stop them, but they were killed and wounded over 70 people and fled in defeat. Then they deployed the military, but the military was equally powerless to stop them. The rest is history." Gangs equipped with a Gallender rifle exhibited a big fish eats small fish phenomenon, rapidly expanding in a short time. The document also detailed another incident. The U.S. military deployed Colonel Johnson's experimental tank unit, but the result was still a crushing defeat. The gangs learned to use 3 Gallanders firing alternately to suppress U.S. fire, preventing U.S. infantry from even surfacing. Tanks, however, struggled to effectively engage in urban warfare, their tracks quickly severed by explosives. In this battle, the U.S. military lost 2 valuable tanks and suffered over 40 casualties. Gangsters against the army, inflicting heavy losses. Colonel Johnson yelled furiously into the phone, "Compared to their rifles, our weapons are garbage. If we don't stop this, we'll be the only country to be seized by gangsters." That very evening, Colonel Johnson approached Joseph. "You must stop selling these rifles. That's a bit of a problem, Colonel." Joseph frowned. Our contract allowed us to freely sell small arms on the market, and these rifles are clearly small arms. Colonel Johnson swallowed hard. Yes, they are small arms, but as you've seen, it's already causing extraordinary chaos in New York, and that chaos is spreading to other cities. It's happening so fast we can't stop it. Joseph remained unmoved. That's none of our business, Colonel. It won't do you any good either, Mr. Joseph. Colonel Johnson's tone was laced with threat. Aren't you worried the gangs will take over your arsenal? Joseph shrugged, looking at the factory. Unless the gangs have the capability to produce, or even maintain, the entire production line, Colonel Johnson thought about it and agreed. The gang could buy Garland rifles from the arsenal at half price, a loss for them. What was the point of the gang controlling the arsenal? They'd get guns at a higher price, only to be unable to maintain them. What if one day the arsenal stopped selling weapons and ammunition to them and instead sold them to their rivals? The gang's demise would be nigh. Therefore, the gang dared not offend the arsenal. All right, Colonel Johnson said helplessly, we'll buy all your rifles, sir. However, Joseph replied, unfortunately, the price has gone up, Colonel. It's double the price now. Colonel Johnson was stunned, about to explode in anger, when Joseph interrupted him. They're selling for 3 times the price on the black market, I think. Hearing this, Colonel Johnson instantly lost his temper. Chapter 673 Smooth War Cannon. Ultimately, Joseph negotiated a unit price of $160 with the U.S. military. Joseph had offered the military a discount. The original price, doubled, would have been $170 per unit. However, Johnson argued that the U.S. military's long-term, large-volume purchases would help spread the development costs of the Garand rifle, and the military factory should offer some concessions. Joseph thought this made sense and reluctantly signed the contract for the first batch of 100,000 rifles. This will bring in at least tens of millions of dollars in profit, Joka said excitedly. You can earn over $100 per rifle, not even counting the cost of ammunition, subsequent maintenance, and replacement parts. Tens of millions of dollars was no small sum in those days. It was enough to build 10 new 2,000-ton destroyers. But Charles felt this wasn't enough, far from enough. He closed the file, turned to Joka, and said, now, we can sell the submachine guns at half price. What? Joka looked at Charles in astonishment. Submachine guns. After a moment's hesitation, Joka added, this will plunge America into another storm, Charles. This is likely a more suitable weapon for the mob than rifles. Mob gangs usually operate in cities, and almost all battles are urban warfare. In urban warfare, submachine guns are undoubtedly king, while the Garand rifles in the U.S. military are better suited for long-range combat in open terrain. Charles calmly replied, that's not something we need to consider, father. We are businessmen. Joka nodded, a hint of helplessness flashing in his eyes. All right, I'll inform Joseph right away. Charles watched Joka leave. He could see the hesitation in Joka's heart. On the matter of the mob, the soft-hearted Joka believed Charles should know when to stop. Selling the rifles was enough to ensure the arms factory could establish itself in New York. Now they're selling submachine guns to civilians at low prices. Although it's for business, as a conscientious capitalist, one should consider the harm that gangs would cause to civilians and society if they possess submachine guns, even in America. Charles doesn't consider these things. He wants to control the American arms market while the American military industry hasn't yet developed. This isn't just about money, it's about vying for power and influence. Facing an industrialized nation like the United States, Charles believes he has no room for soft-heartedness. He can only use gangs to quickly seize the military market. Otherwise, American capitalists might be able to overtake them with their powerful industrial capabilities. Inside the tank gun laboratory, things are bustling with activity. Joka built it next to the artillery factory to facilitate communication between researchers and technicians. The initial planned area is over 3,000 square meters, enough to build a tank gun production line. This proved necessary, as the laboratory researchers built almost an entire artillery production line there, except for the gun barrels. However, Stokes recently discovered that they might have to produce the gun barrels themselves. The reason was that shortening the breech block reduced weight but also shifted the center of gravity forward, making the original barrel length unsuitable for tank guns. Stokes and several researchers had a heated discussion about this issue. They were roughly divided into 2 camps. One was to use the original barrel, and the other was to produce their own barrels and shorten them. Using the original barrel can save time and money, All we need to do is add counterweight to the breech block. Are you crazy? Every bit of space and weight inside the tank is precious. They are trying every possible way to reduce weight, and you want to add counterweight. It's pointless, but producing the barrel is difficult and takes a long time, and we are currently at war. Stokes remained silent throughout. Both sides seemed to have valid points. The former was more in line with immediate interests, while the latter considered the long term. If only Charles were here, he would be the one to make the decision. Just then, Stokes was surprised to see Charles, dressed in a general's uniform, enter through the main gate with the Joka. He quickly led the researchers to greet them. Mr. Joka, General. Stokes warmly shook hands with the two men. Welcome. The researchers also stepped forward to shake hands with the two, their eyes filled with admiration as they shook hands with Charles. It's a pleasure to meet you, General. We've all heard of you, General. It's an honor to serve you. Compared to your command, we hardly dare to discuss the war. The researchers chuckled, their expressions slightly embarrassed. They were referring to the poor performance of the British Expeditionary Force. As British themselves, they always felt a sense of disappointment and pity whenever they discussed and compared the performance of the British and French armies. Charles replied with an approachable smile, that's because they didn't make good use of you. I heard they actually planned to recruit you into the army. Incredible. You are top talents. Your contributions are worth at least several infantry divisions, yet they only want to give you a rifle and send you to the battlefield. Charles subtly flattered them. He knew that talented people often valued their self-worth more than their salary. Sure enough, the researchers' gazes towards Charles instantly changed. God, so this is how Charles sees us? Our decision was right. He values us, and we can work for him with peace of mind. This is recognition, affirmation, and trust. Nothing is more important than these. Any difficulties? Charles asked, having just witnessed a group arguing. It's like this. Stokes led Charles to his desk, looking at the blueprints. We're considering whether it's necessary to produce our own gun barrels. The existing barrels no longer meet the requirements of the new tank gun. Of course it's necessary, Charles said firmly. I will provide all the funding, and you can obtain all the necessary technology from the artillery factory. The artillery factory was the production line for British 6-inch, 152 mm, caliber guns, and its barrel technology was similar to that of 75 mm guns. Stokes was somewhat surprised. He hadn't expected Charles to make a decision so quickly, without any hesitation. You may not know this, General, but this could double the research and development budget, Stokes said. There's still time, because producing the barrel is difficult, especially the 28 right-hand rifling grooves inside the bore. Note, the French 75 mm gun is a rifle gun, using a 2.69 meter long 36 caliber barrel with 28 right-hand rifling grooves inside the bore. I know, Charles replied, but we can simplify production appropriately. For example, by removing the rifling and converting it to a smooth bore. Stokes and the researchers exchanged glances, then unanimously objected. I don't recommend doing that, General. Rifle guns have higher accuracy than smoothbore guns. Not only that, rifle guns have a longer range because they cause the projectile to spin, making it more stable. We would rather increase the counterweight than convert it to a smoothbore. It would greatly impact combat effectiveness. Chapter 674 Improving Anti-Aircraft Guns. The development of tank guns has gone through a process from smoothbore to rifled and back to smoothbore. Initially, most tank guns were smoothbore. The St. Chamond's direct mounting of a 75 mm gun was considered an anomaly. This was because tanks were more rudimentary at the time, and most people perceived them as shields to stop bullets, with little emphasis on the accuracy of the gun. However, as tanks developed, the demands on tank guns on the battlefield increased, and they gradually transitioned to rifled guns. Compared to smoothbore guns, rifle guns had many advantages, longer range and higher accuracy. This often played a decisive role in tank warfare. When two tanks met at the same distance and with similar armor capabilities, a well-aimed rifle gun could often achieve a decisive victory with a single hit. This was fatal for smoothbore guns, hence most tank guns during World War II were rifled. But all of this was completely overturned by the advent of the fin-stabilized discarding sabot armor-piercing projectile. The image above shows a fin-stabilized discarding sabot armor-piercing projectile. Its saddle-shaped sabot detaches automatically during firing, hence the name discarding sabot. The projectile that ultimately hits the target is actually a fin-stabilized arrow-shaped body, maintaining stable flight instead of tumbling in the air. Rifled cannons have the advantages of long range and high accuracy because the rifling causes the projectile to spin, maintaining stable flight. However, if a smoothbore cannon uses an arrow-shaped projectile, it can achieve the same stable flight and improved accuracy. Thus, the advantages of rifled cannons are completely surpassed by smoothbore cannons and cease to be advantages, while the disadvantages of rifled cannons remain unavoidable. Because of the rifling, they are expensive to manufacture. Because of the rifling, each shot generates intense friction between the rifling and the projectile, resulting in a short lifespan. Because of the rifling, friction between the projectile and the rifling consumes a lot of kinetic energy, resulting in low muzzle velocity and weak armor penetration. In short, rifled cannons are arguably inferior to smoothbore cannons. Note, after World War II, almost all countries switched to smoothbore cannons, except for Britain and its colonies, which stubbornly continued to use rifled cannons. Not long ago, Britain finally gave in and began purchasing German smoothbore cannons for conversion, but by then its smoothbore cannon production technology was far behind the world's leading nations. Knowing this development process, Charles firmly chose smoothbore cannons. Why go through the detours when you can achieve the best in one step? Currently, other countries don't have dedicated tank guns, so Charles doesn't need to worry. The 75mm smoothbore cannon is sufficient. Once other countries develop dedicated tank guns and rifled cannons, Charles can simply pull out the blueprints for the fin-stabilized discarding sabot projectile and throw them on the table. Everyone here is garbage. Your rifled cannons are all expensive and ineffective equipment. Discard them all. Use smoothbore cannons with disarmament armor like me, or you'll only be waiting to die. Of course, Charles wouldn't say these things to Stokes and the researchers. It wasn't the right time, and there was no need. If others knew about such an advanced concept and used it first, it clearly wouldn't be in Charles's capitalist interest. They had to get all the countries in the world to invest heavily in rifled cannons, go through all the hardships of developing them, and then force them to scrap them. It's wartime now, gentlemen. Charles found a perfect excuse. You know the battlefield can't wait that long. We need to equip ourselves with a large number of tanks quickly, especially since France is currently facing a severe shortage of manpower and resources. We have to make compromises. Stokes and the researchers were stunned. Charles was right, they couldn't refute it. After a while, Stokes took the lead in agreeing, the general is right. We must consider the practicalities when developing equipment for the battlefield. The researchers nodded one after another. Yes, we only consider the equipment itself without considering the actual situation. France has already implemented a rationing system. Producing expensive rifled cannons is indeed not suitable. If we can't achieve sufficient scale, it won't be able to exert its due combat effectiveness on the battlefield. I agree with the general's idea. Thus, the issue was resolved. The new tank gun would use a smoothbore cannon, which is simple to manufacture and inexpensive. Note, modern tanks use smoothbore cannons, which, due to their more complex manufacturing processes, increase lifespan and performance, are often more expensive than rifled cannons. However, smoothbore cannons used in World War I and World War II were much cheaper than rifled cannons. After discussing this issue, Stokes led Charles and Joka to his office. Charles was surprised to find that Stokes' office was very luxurious, over 100 square meters, divided into 3 rooms and a living room, a secretary's office, a communications room, a study, and all kinds of facilities, even exercise equipment. Charles glanced at Joka with a puzzled look. This far exceeded the specifications of his own office. Joka nodded slightly, a smile in his eyes, as if to say, only in this way can we retain talent. It's worth it. Charles looked somewhat helpless. He wanted to say, Father, Stokes is, in principle, a traitor. You don't need to worry about not being able to retain him. Stokes warmly invited the two to sit down on the sofa. What would you like to drink? Charles ordered coffee, Joka ordered wine, and Stokes himself ordered a glass of wine. Soon, the secretary brought them drinks, along with a plate of sliced apples and pastries. These were things that ordinary families couldn't easily afford during the rationing period. Your son is excellent, Mr. Joka. Stokes smiled and clinked glasses with Joka, complimenting him. He solved a problem we'd been arguing about for days with just a few words. Thank you, Mr. Stokes. Joka readily accepted. He is indeed excellent. Charles didn't say much, but took a blueprint from his briefcase and handed it to Stokes. Can you produce this, Mr. Stokes? Stokes took the blueprint and a hint of surprise flashed in his eyes. A cannon? Why don't you give it to an artillery factory? I think they can definitely produce this cannon. This is not an ordinary cannon, sir, Charles replied. It was the Oerlikon anti-aircraft gun, which, after modifications, could also be mounted on aircraft as an aircraft cannon. We have this weapon, with a similar structure, Charles explained. It's called a Becker cannon. We captured it from the Germans, and I need you to improve it according to the specifications and data in the blueprints. Charles then handed Stokes another document, pictures and data for the Becker cannon. Stokes immediately understood with an "Oh, this was indeed something these mechanics excelled at?" He compared the two blueprints side by side for a moment, then confidently agreed, "No problem, this doesn't look difficult." Chapter 675 Attack on Charleroi. Sorry, I only have one chapter today due to other commitments. After things settled down in Paris, Charles flew to Namur that morning. The enclosed cabin was undeniably convenient for Charles. He slept during the flight and ate some cake prepared by Camille for lunch. Camille mentioned that there was still a lot of food left over from neighbors, but Charles didn't intend to touch it, nor did he allow Camille or Joka to touch it. Instead, he had Laurent distribute the food to the guards, all of it. In times of scarcity, this amount of food was significant. Although the guards had expanded to a regiment, and each person received only a small amount each time, it still added up to a considerable sum over time, making the guards extremely grateful to Charles. However, Charles was actually worried that spies might poison him and his family. This wasn't difficult. The sources of the gifts were too complex. Even a time bomb could be delivered. Considering this, Charles thought that giving the gifts to the guards was a good practice. This would make spies realize that poisoning or tampering with the gifts would be ineffective, not only useless but also potentially exposing them, thus discouraging them from doing so. At 2 p.m., the plane landed smoothly at Namur Airport. Charles then traveled by car for over half an hour to reach the command post. This was one of the drawbacks of having the command post located within Namur Castle, which was situated on a hill, making it difficult to construct a temporary airfield for takeoffs and landings. Tigeny was busy at the command post, telegrams and documents flying everywhere, staff running back and forth, as if a battle were underway. Charles knew why. He had already given Tigeny orders to oversee preparations for infiltrating the Ardennes. Of course, this was classified. Only Charles, Gallieni, and Tigeny knew. The staff only knew that the next target was Charleroi, and everything they were doing was in preparation for its attack. Upon Charles's arrival, Tigeny saluted and led him into the conference room. Emperor Albert I has implemented wartime rationing in Belgium, Tigeny said, sitting down in front of Charles with a thick stack of documents, his tone laced with sarcasm. He says everything will be done according to French standards, but everyone knows that when he says France, he means Charles. Charles smiled slightly. Belgium maintained logistical trade with the Netherlands, and the port of Antwerp received supplies from around the world. The people here weren't yet at the point where France was starving. Emperor Albert I did this primarily to suppress the restless capitalists within the country through wartime rationing. Of course, there was another intention, to improve the rations of Charles' troops. Tigeny handed the documents to Charles one by one, his tone casual. This is the re-equipment situation of the 1st Panzer Corps, this is the reconnaissance situation in the Ardennes, and this is the troop strength and deployment of Charleroi's army. Charles opened the documents and examined them one by one. The re-equipment of the more than 20,000 men of the 1st Panzer Corps went very smoothly. The infantry, except for the submachine gunners, were basically equipped with German G98 and K98 rifles. These were original rifles captured from the German army. 400,000 were captured in the Hasselt infiltration alone. Albert I selected 30,000 rifles in good condition and assigned them to the 1st Panzer Division. 20,000 were used for initial deployment, and the remaining 10,000 were for supplementary use. The two images above show the G98 and K98 respectively. The G98 was more reliable and accurate, but its length made it inconvenient to use in trenches, so the K98 was developed in 1908 with a shorter barrel. The smooth transition was largely due to the shortcomings of the Lebel rifle. Most soldiers found it difficult to adapt to the change in center of gravity, so they had little objection to the Mauser, and were actually happy to accept it because of its superior performance. The only objections came from the Tigeny troops, numbering over 2,000, who had been equipped with a Garand rifle. They were accustomed to semi-automatic rifles, and going back to bolt-action rifles was a nightmare for them. Many people have questions about the equipment switch, Tigeny said. They don't understand why we're switching to German rifles at this time. Especially since we don't have any unacceptable supply problems. Tidjany didn't know how to explain it. He couldn't tell the soldiers that the troops would be advancing through the Ardennes. Charles offered an excuse. We've captured a large number of German rifles and ammunition but can't use them all, while we're facing ammunition shortages back home. Tidjany raised an eyebrow. That was the only explanation, though still somewhat weak. Charles had only glanced at the reconnaissance situation in the Ardennes. It was just a matter of clearing mountains and blasting roads. Not long ago, Charles had even modified a horse into an engineering vehicle, using the Charler A1 chassis. Adding a bulldozer blade turned it into a bulldozer, or adding a few booms and pulleys turned it into a crane. With this equipment, the speed of road and bridge construction would be much faster. How do you plan to attack Charleroi? Charles closed the file and looked at Tidjany. This was Charles's biggest concern at the moment. Tidjany gestured with his chin toward the documents and replied, the Germans in Charleroi only have 2 infantry regiments, a little over 5,000 men. Do we need to consider how to fight them? I've heard they were prepared to surrender, and there have even been deserters. I believe that as soon as our troops arrive there, the Germans will abandon the city and flee. Charleroi is an isolated city, and a significant portion of the German troops stationed there are deserters, their morale low. If Charles's 1st Panzer Corps were to press in, they might lose their will to resist and collapse. However, Charles countered, General, where do you think they'll flee to? Tidjany replied, to the mountains, of course. Tidjany suddenly realized his mistake. He stared blankly at Charles, then a somewhat embarrassed smile appeared on his face. Another implication of the German retreat to the mountains was that many would hide in the Ardennes forest. And the 1st Panzer Corps plan was to advance along the Ardennes forest. This would lead the fleeing German soldiers to believe that the 1st Panzer Corps was entering the forest to hunt them down, causing them to run away in disarray. Ultimately, the 1st Panzer Corps infiltration plan might be tipped off to the Germans by these fleeing soldiers, causing the entire plan to fail. Tidjany stared at the map for a moment, then said with difficulty, but it seems we can't stop the Germans from escaping into the mountains. 6th Army, General, Charles interrupted Tidjany, the Germans in Charleroi think we'll attack with the 1st Panzer Corps, but we've instead used the 6th Army to encircle them and cut off their retreat in the forest. Tidjany immediately understood, it was another feint. Moreover, it provided a perfect excuse for the troops to enter the Ardennes mountains, allowing the 6th Army's infantry to enter the forest first and pave the way for the 1st Panzer Corps. End of this chapter. Thank you so much for reading until the end. Don't forget to give it a like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription or donation encourages us to continue. Thank you all. See you in the next video.